Elizabeth Carter did not weep. She did not plead. She stood in the center of Whitmore's grand hall, surrounded by every name that mattered in Virginia, and she pulled the gloves from her hands one finger at a time. "Bring my carriage," she said. "Now." Her husband's jaw tightened. His mistress smiled. Neither of them understood yet what that quiet voice was carrying. If you're new here, subscribe and follow Elizabeth's story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this tale travels. The summer of 1815 came to Albemarle County, Virginia, the way it always did, slow, heavy, and without apology. The air sat thick over the tobacco fields, and the great houses along the ridge road kept their shutters half drawn against the heat, their interiors cool and dim, and full of things nobody talked about. Elizabeth Carter rode into that world in a hired coach because the Carter family no longer kept their own. She was 24 years old. She wore her best dress, which was also her plainest, a pale gray wool that had been let out twice at the seams because she had grown since her mother purchased it, and her mother was no longer alive to buy her another. Her hair was pinned tight. Her hands were folded in her lap. She had spent the last 6 hours telling herself that what she was doing was reasonable, practical, the sort of decision a sensible woman made when the alternatives had run out. She had almost believed it. Whitmore Plantation rose above the tree line before the coach turned the final bend, and Elizabeth's breath caught in spite of herself. She had seen fine houses before. Her father had kept a decent home in Richmond before the losses began, before the creditors, before the long, awful slide that ended with Thomas Carter signing papers he didn't fully understand in a lawyer's office, while his daughter stood outside in the hall and listened to everything through the door. But Whitmore was something else entirely. The main house was 3 stories of red brick with white columns along the front portico, and it sat at the end of a long, oak-lined drive, as though it had always been there and always intended to remain. The grounds ran south toward the river and north toward the ridge, and everything, every fence line, every outbuilding, every sweep of manicured lawn, announced the same thing in the same quiet, iron-certain voice. This belongs to someone who has never had to wonder whether it would. The coach stopped. A young stableman came forward to hold the horses. Nobody else appeared. Elizabeth waited a moment, then opened the door herself and stepped down. The stableman glanced at her sideways. She gave him a small nod, the kind her mother had taught her, not imperious, not uncertain, just steady, and he looked away. She was standing on the gravel drive with her single traveling trunk being unloaded behind her when the front door opened and a woman appeared on the portico. Not Nathaniel Whitmore. A woman. She was perhaps 30 years old, dark-haired, dressed in deep blue silk that had no business being worn before noon on a weekday. She moved down the front steps with the unhurried confidence of someone who had descended those steps 1,000 times and expected to descend them 1,000 more. Her eyes swept over Elizabeth with the particular efficiency of a woman assessing a rival, and whatever she found in that assessment, she allowed herself one small satisfied smile before she composed her face into something warmer. "Miss Carter," she said, "what a long journey you must have had." "It was manageable," Elizabeth said. "I'm Caroline Hayes." The woman extended her hand. "I've been helping Nathaniel manage the household these past 2 years. He asked me to welcome you as he's been detained with business this morning." Elizabeth shook the offered hand. It was cool and dry and very firm. "That's very kind." "Not at all." Caroline turned and moved back toward the house, clearly expecting Elizabeth to follow. "Come, Martha will show you to your rooms. Nathaniel will join us for supper." Elizabeth followed. She noted the way the 2 housemaids near the door stepped back for Caroline without being asked. She noted the way Caroline moved through the entrance hall, not as a guest, not as a neighbor who had stepped in to help, but as someone who knew precisely where everything was kept and expected it to stay there. She noted all of it, and she filed it away, and she said nothing. Nathaniel Whitmore arrived at supper precisely on time, which was the first thing Elizabeth learned about him. He was a man who controlled what he could control, and he controlled his schedule, the way other men controlled their tempers, absolutely and without visible effort. How was 33 years old, taller than she'd expected, with dark hair that needed cutting, and the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now merely severe. He had his father's jaw according to the portrait in the entrance hall, and his mother's eyes gray, cool, watchful. He moved through his own dining room, the way he moved through everything Elizabeth would later understand, as though he had already accounted for every person in it and found none of them surprising. He pulled out her chair. It was a courtesy, nothing more. "Miss Carter," he said, "I trust the journey was not too difficult." "It was fine," she said. "Good." He sat. He unfolded his napkin. "I apologize for not greeting you myself. The harvest accounts required attention." "Of course." Caroline, seated across the table, lifted her wineglass and watched them both with those dark, measuring eyes. The meal was excellent. The conversation was not. Nathaniel asked her 2 questions about her journey and 1 about her father's health, each delivered with the precise, considered courtesy of a man fulfilling an obligation. Elizabeth answered each one. She did not ask questions in return, not yet. She was still learning the geography of this place, still mapping the silences and the distances and the small invisible lines that everyone at the table seemed to know not to cross. After supper, Nathaniel excused himself to his study. Caroline stayed. "He's not an easy man," Caroline said, pouring herself more wine without being asked. "But he's a fair one in his way." "I didn't expect easy," Elizabeth said. Caroline tilted her head. "No, I don't suppose you did." A pause. "You should know the staff takes their direction from whoever holds the household. That's been me these past 2 years. I'll be happy to show you how things are done." Elizabeth looked at her steadily. "I'm sure I'll find my way." Something moved behind Caroline's eyes. Not anger. Not quite. Something cooler than anger, more patient than irritation. "Of course," she said pleasantly. "Of course you will." Martha Collins found her the next morning. The housekeeper was 58 years old, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, with the particular economy of movement that came from 30 years of managing a large household. She had served the Whitmore family since before Nathaniel was born. She had known his mother. She did not smile when she introduced herself. She did not offer the kind of warm welcome that some housekeepers gave a new mistress. The reassuring words, the careful deference, the cup of tea, and the tour of the linen closet meant to make a woman feel she had arrived somewhere that wanted her. But she met Elizabeth's eyes directly, and that was something. "I'll show you the house," she said, "if you're ready." "I'm ready," Elizabeth said. Martha walked her through every room on the main floor. Every outbuilding she could see from the windows, the kitchen garden, and the smokehouse, and the spring house. She answered every question Elizabeth asked, and Elizabeth asked many with the same measured directness. She did not elaborate. She did not volunteer. But when they reached the east wing, she slowed. There was a door at the end of the corridor, heavier than the others, with a different lock. "What's in there?" Elizabeth asked. A pause, not long, just enough to notice. "Storage," Martha said. "Old records, things from before." She moved on before Elizabeth could ask what before meant. The weeks that followed were an education in invisibility. Nathaniel was courteous and absent. He appeared at supper most evenings, spoke when spoken to, and withdrew to his study before the candles burned low. He managed his estate with the same closed, efficient intensity he brought to everything, and he did not consult Elizabeth on any matter related to it. She had not expected him to, but she had expected to be given something to manage. The household at minimum. The menus, the staff, the domestic accounts. These were a wife's domain. Every woman she had ever known had understood that. But every domestic decision at Whitmore already had a decision-maker. "We'll serve the lamb on Thursday," Caroline said, appearing in the kitchen doorway while Elizabeth was speaking with the cook. "Nathaniel prefers it at the end of the week." The cook looked at Caroline. Then, almost imperceptibly, she looked at Elizabeth and waited. Elizabeth smiled very gently. "The lamb on Thursday sounds fine," she said. She went back to her room and sat for a long time. She was not a woman who cried easily. Her father had said that about her since she was small. Lizzie doesn't cry, she thinks, and it was true mostly. What she did instead of crying was put things in order. List them. Line them up and look at them clearly. Here was what she had. A marriage that was by all legal measure real. A husband who treated her like a ledger entry he'd balanced and forgotten. A household that was already run by someone else. And a housekeeper who had paused for just a moment outside a locked door. Here was what she did not have any understanding of why. She pulled out the small notebook she kept in her traveling trunk. Her father's habit passed down to her, the habit of writing things down, when the world got too large to hold in your head, and she began to write. Caroline Hayes, widow. 2 years in the household. Staff defers to her. Nathaniel trusts her. Moves through this house like she owns it. She stopped. She thought. She wrote one more line. Why? She began to pay attention in earnest. Not obviously. Not in the way that telegraphed itself to the room, the way some women investigated loudly, emotionally, making everyone aware that they were suspicious and wounded and demanding answers. Elizabeth moved quietly. She had learned quiet from necessity, from years of listening at her father's study door, from years of watching the men who came to the house, and understanding before her father did which ones intended harm. She took her embroidery to the parlor where Caroline held her afternoon visits. She sat near the window and kept her eyes on her work and listened. She walked the grounds in the morning early before most of the household was fully awake, and she talked to the stable hands and the kitchen maids and the field workers, the way her mother had once talked to the people who worked for them, not as a mistress condescending, but as a neighbor, a person, someone who used their names and remembered what they'd said the week before. One of the stable hands, a young man named William, mentioned almost in passing that Mrs. Hayes had a brother who used to work as a factor for one of the large merchant houses in Richmond. Used to? Elizabeth asked. William shrugged. Don't rightly know what happened to him. Just that he don't work there no more. She wrote it down. She began to find her way into the household accounts. This required patience. Nathaniel kept the estate records in his study, and the study was kept locked when he was not in it. But the domestic accounts, the household spending, the staff wages, the purchasing records were kept in a smaller book in the kitchen office, and that was not locked because nobody had ever thought a woman would care to read it. Elizabeth cared. She started with the current year and worked backward, and what she found in the first 3 months of looking was nothing remarkable. Ordinary domestic expenditures, nothing out of place, nothing that would raise a question. But the older records, the ones from 2 and 3 years prior, told a different story. There were payments to a merchant firm in Richmond that didn't correspond to any goods she could trace. Modest amounts at first, $30 here, $50 there, but steady monthly appearing on the same week every time. The firm's name was listed as Hayes and Lorne Commercial. Elizabeth sat very still for a moment. Then she checked the name again. Hayes. She closed the book carefully. She replaced it exactly as she'd found it. She went back to her room and added 3 lines to her notebook. Payments to Hayes and Lorne Commercial. Monthly. No corresponding inventory. Who is Lorne? Is this what the locked room holds? She found out about the locked room by accident. Or rather, she found out the way all important things were found out, not by accident, but by being in the right place when someone else made a mistake. She was coming back from the kitchen garden on a Tuesday morning when she heard voices in the East Wing corridor. She recognized Nathaniel's voice immediately, that low controlled register he never raised even when the words behind it were cutting. The other voice was Martha's. She did not stop walking. She did not slow. But she chose the longer way around the way that took her past the East Wing entrance, and she kept her footsteps quiet. Not something she needs to know, Nathaniel was saying. Martha's voice was lower. Elizabeth caught only fragments. Your mother's records, sir. And then, Caroline has already taken the... And then something she couldn't make out at all. Nathaniel again, very flat. Leave it. A silence. Then Martha. Yes, sir. Elizabeth turned the corner and kept walking. She went to the parlor and sat and picked up her embroidery and began to stitch, and her hands did not shake, and she did not look up when Caroline passed the doorway 10 minutes later, with her blue silk dress rustling, and her eyes moving through the room with that perpetual inventory she seemed to be taking of every space she entered. But when Caroline was gone, Elizabeth sat alone for a long time. Your mother's records. Caroline has already taken. Nathaniel's mother had died 4 years ago. A fall, the story went. An accident on the back stairs in the winter when the treads were cold and a woman might easily lose her footing. Elizabeth had heard it from 3 separate people. Since her arrival, always delivered with the same careful neutrality, the same slight pause before the word accident, as though they were testing it against some private knowledge and finding it adequate barely. She had not asked about it directly. She had not known yet that it mattered. Now she thought that perhaps it mattered very much. The confrontation came on a Wednesday evening in August, 6 weeks into Elizabeth's time at Whitmore. She had not planned it. She had planned patience, a long and careful accumulation of evidence before she said a word to anyone. But Caroline had not given her patience. Elizabeth had been speaking with one of the kitchen maids, a girl named Bess, barely 17, who had done something wrong with the bread, and was tearfully explaining herself when Caroline appeared in the kitchen doorway with the particular expression of someone arriving to make a correction. "Bess," she said without acknowledging Elizabeth at all, "that will come out of your wages. Mr. Whitmore won't tolerate waste." Bess's face crumpled. "Mrs. Hayes," Elizabeth said. Caroline turned, and there was something in her expression that said she had expected to be challenged and was faintly amused by it. "Mrs. Whitmore." She said the title with perfect practiced correctness, just a shade too precise, just enough that they both heard what was underneath it. "You think that title means something here?" "Bess will not have her wages docked," Elizabeth said. "The bread was a mistake and she knows it. That's sufficient." A pause. The kitchen had gone very still. Nathaniel's instructions to the staff are quite clear regarding, "I am aware of my husband's instructions," Elizabeth said, "and I am the mistress of this household. What I have said stands." It was the first time she had used those words, not with Nathaniel, not with Martha, with Caroline now in the kitchen with flour still on Bess's apron and the morning light coming hard through the open window. The silence stretched. Caroline smiled. It was a beautiful smile, the kind that had been perfected over years until it showed nothing at all. "Of course," she said. "As you say." She left. Bess looked at Elizabeth with wide, uncertain eyes. "Get the next batch started," Elizabeth said gently. "You know what went wrong. Fix it." "Yes, ma'am," the girl whispered. "Thank you, ma'am." Elizabeth went to find Nathaniel. Howe was in his study, where he always was in the afternoon. She knocked once. He told her to come in. Howe was at his desk with ledgers open before him, and he did not rise when she entered, which she noted and set aside for later. He looked up. He waited. "I need to speak with you," she said. "About Mrs. Hayes." Something shifted in his expression. Not anger. Closer to resignation, as though he had been expecting this, and was mildly irritated that it had arrived today rather than some other day. "Elizabeth." "She countermanded my direction to the kitchen staff," Elizabeth said, "in front of the staff. Caroline manages the household." "I am your wife," Elizabeth said. She said it quietly. She did not raise her voice. She had found in her 24 years that raising her voice had never once produced the result she wanted, and so she had learned to make her quiet carry what other women's volume could not. He looked at her. Really looked at her perhaps for the first time since the wedding. "Yes," he said. "You are. Then I should be permitted to function as such." She held his gaze. "I don't intend to make things difficult, Nathaniel. But I cannot manage a household in which the staff does not know who holds that authority." Another pause. She could see him weighing something, not her argument, she thought, but something else. Some other calculation she didn't yet understand. "I'll speak to Caroline," he said finally. "Thank you." She turned to leave. "Elizabeth." His voice stopped her. She turned back. He was still looking at her with that same unreadable expression, gray eyes, cool and evaluating, and for just a moment, something else. Something that might in another man have been called consideration. "You've been reviewing the household accounts." It was not a question. She met his eyes. "I have." Why? Because I'm the mistress of this household, she said. And I take that seriously. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once and looked back at his ledgers. She left. In the corridor outside his study, she stopped and pressed her back against the wall for just a moment. Not because she needed the support, but because she needed a breath. One single quiet breath to settle everything that was moving too fast beneath her surface. He knew she'd been reading the accounts, and he had not told her to stop. She pushed off the wall and walked back toward her room, and she was already thinking about what came next. What came next was Martha. The housekeeper appeared at Elizabeth's door that evening after supper, something she had never done before. She stood in the hallway with her hands folded and her face in its usual composed stillness, but there was something underneath that stillness tonight that hadn't been there before. "May I come in?" Martha asked. "Please," Elizabeth said. Martha came in. She did not sit. She stood near the window and looked out at the darkening grounds for a moment, as though gathering herself, and then she turned. "You asked about the locked room," Martha said. Elizabeth said nothing. She waited. "It was Mrs. Whitmore's room," Martha said. "The mother, Eleanor Whitmore. After she died, Mr. Whitmore, the son Nathaniel, he locked it. Said he'd see to it himself when he was ready." A pause. "He hasn't been ready." "What's in it?" Elizabeth asked. Martha looked at her steadily. Her records, her personal letters, her household accounts going back 20 years. Another pause. And 3 years of correspondence that was never explained. Correspondence with whom? With Caroline Hayes's late husband, Martha said. Before he died. When he was still working as a factor. When he was managing some of the estate's off-site transactions. The room was very quiet. "Mrs. Collins," Elizabeth said carefully. "Did you know Eleanor Whitmore well?" "Since she was a young bride," Martha said. "I knew her the way you know someone you've watched over for 30 years. Her jaw tightened very slightly. She was not careless. She did not lose her footing on stairs she had walked every day of her adult life. Elizabeth heard everything in those words that Martha was not saying. "The correspondence," Elizabeth said. "Could it still be there in the locked room?" "I believe so," Martha said. "Caroline has tried more than once to get in. Nathaniel has refused her, though he doesn't know why she wants it. He thinks she wants to clear out the room, make it useful again." Martha paused. "He trusts her. He's trusted her since his mother died, and she stepped in to manage things, and he was too grieved to question it." Elizabeth thought about a young man, newly bereaved, suddenly alone with an estate to run, and grief he had no language for. She thought about a woman who would have known exactly how to be useful in those circumstances. She thought about monthly payments to Hayes and Lorne Commercial that didn't correspond to any goods received. "Martha," she said, "do you know where the key is kept?" Martha looked at her for a long time. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron and set a small brass key on the table between them. "I've been keeping it," she said, "for the right person to use it." Elizabeth went to the locked room that night. The corridor was empty. The house had settled into its nighttime quiet, and the only light was the candle she carried sheltered with her palm against the drift from the windows. She unlocked the door and went in. The room smelled of cedar and old paper, and something else lavender. She thought the kind a woman might put in her linens. Eleanor Whitmore's presence still lived in that smell, in the careful arrangement of the furniture, in the small writing desk set near the window, with its surface still holding. After 4 years, the faint ink stains of a woman who had written a great deal. Elizabeth went to the desk. The drawers were not locked. She opened them one by one methodically, and what she found was what Martha had said, letters, records, accounts going back years. Most of it was ordinary household correspondence. But in the bottom drawer behind a false back that took her a moment to find, there was a separate bundle, tied with brown string, addressed in a hand that was not Eleanor's to Mrs. E. Whitmore Private. Elizabeth sat down at the dead woman's desk and untied the string. She read for an hour. When she was finished, she sat for a long time without moving. Then she retied the bundle exactly as she'd found it. She replaced the false back. She closed the drawer. She locked the room behind her and went back to her own room with the candle burning low in her hand, and she sat at her own small desk and opened her notebook. She wrote for a long time. When she finally set down the pen, her hand was steady. Her mind was clear in the way her mind became when she had finally understood what she was looking at, when the pieces had found their places, and the shape of the whole had revealed itself at last. What was in those letters was not proof. Not yet. Not the kind that would hold up in front of men who needed things written in law's language before they would believe them. But it was the beginning of proof. And Elizabeth Carter, the daughter of a man who had lost everything, because he hadn't known what he was dealing with until it was too late, knew exactly how to build the rest of it. She closed her notebook. She blew out the candle. She lay down in the dark room of her husband's house, and she thought about Caroline Hayes, and the payments, and the letters, and a woman who had died on stairs she walked every day. She thought about what it meant to know the truth before you could prove it, and she understood with the same cold clarity that had always been her most reliable companion that she was going to need more time. She was going to need to be patient. She was going to need to be quiet and careful and invisible for a little while longer. And then she was going to need to be absolutely devastatingly loud. She closed her eyes. She slept. The morning after Elizabeth read Eleanor Whitmore's letters, she made herself eat breakfast. This was not a small thing. Her stomach had been knotted since she'd walked out of that locked room, and the knot had not loosened through the night. But she sat at the breakfast table, and she ate her toast, and she drank her coffee, and when Caroline appeared in the doorway, as Caroline always appeared at precisely the moment when her presence would be noticed, Elizabeth looked up and smiled. "Good morning," Elizabeth said. Caroline studied her for a moment. "You look tired." "I slept well, thank you." Another moment. Then Caroline moved into the room, poured herself coffee from the sideboard, and sat. She had a way of sitting at other people's tables that made them feel like visitors. Elizabeth had noticed it from the first morning. She noticed it again now. "Nathaniel tells me you've been reviewing the household accounts," Caroline said pleasantly. Elizabeth buttered her second piece of toast. "I have." "Find anything interesting?" "I find accounts very interesting in general," Elizabeth said. "My father kept them himself. He taught me young." Caroline wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The gesture was casual. The stillness behind it was not. "Most women leave that to their husbands." "Most women," Elizabeth agreed. She took a bite of her toast. Caroline set down her cup and left. Elizabeth finished her breakfast alone, and she thought about the letters she had read the night before, and she thought about what kind of woman made a comment like that. Most women leave that to their husbands, to a woman who had just said she'd been reviewing the household accounts. The kind of woman who wanted to know what had been found. The kind of woman who was beneath that perfect composure, afraid. The letters from Caroline's late husband, Gerald Hayes, had been addressed to Eleanor Whitmore across a span of nearly 3 years, beginning in the spring of 1811. They were not love letters. They were nothing so simple. They were the letters of a man trying to warn a woman who was trying to stop something. Both of them moving too slowly against something that was moving faster than either of them understood. Gerald Hayes had been, as William the stable hand had said, a factor for a merchant house in Richmond. What William hadn't known, what perhaps very few people had known, was that Gerald Hayes had also been the man managing a particular set of financial transfers on behalf of Whitmore Plantation for 2 years before his death. Transfers he had not authorized. Transfers his letters said that he had discovered only when he began to investigate a discrepancy in the estate accounts, a pattern of outgoing payments to a firm he could not trace to any legitimate transaction. "Someone is using my name and my connection to this household," he had written to Eleanor in the autumn of 1812, to move money out of the estate in amounts large enough to matter, but small enough not to be immediately visible. "I do not yet know who. I know it is not the master of the house. The authorizations carry a different signature one. I do not recognize, though I have seen it before, somewhere I cannot yet place. I am writing to you because I believe you have seen it too." Eleanor had written back. Her replies were not in the bundle they had been, Gerald's letters kept by Eleanor, not hers, but their content could be inferred from his responses. She had, it seemed, been investigating on her own end. She had found the signature. She had identified the firm. Hayes and Lorne Commercial. I must be very clear, Gerald had written in December of 1812. The Lorne in Hayes and Lorne is not a person. It is a name my wife chose when she registered the firm without my knowledge. I have only just discovered this. I am telling you so that you understand that when I say I do not know how far this goes, I mean it. I did not know what my wife was capable of. I am beginning to understand that I underestimated her considerably. He had died in March of 1813. A fever, the official account said. He had been ill for 2 weeks. It had come on suddenly. Eleanor Whitmore had died 8 months later. A fall on the back stairs. Elizabeth had read those letters in the candlelit room that smelled of lavender, and she had felt something settle in her chest. Not anger. Not yet. But something colder and more precise than anger. The kind of feeling that came when you finally understood the shape of the thing you were looking at. When the outline became clear. She had 2 deaths. She had a pattern of financial theft. She had a woman who had registered a firm in her own husband's name without his knowledge, who had moved money out of an estate for years, who had positioned herself after the death of everyone who could expose her as the trusted confidant of the grieving heir. She did not yet have proof. But she had Gerald Hayes's letters, and she had Eleanor's household accounts, and she had a mind that her father had trained since she was old enough to hold a pen to read numbers the way other people read sentences for what they said and what they didn't say, and where the gap between the two was hiding something. She was going to need both. She went to Nathaniel that afternoon. Not about the letters. Not yet. She was not ready to show him the letters. He would want to know how she had found them, and she would have to tell him about Martha, and she did not want to put Martha in that position before she had something more solid than a dead man's 3-year-old correspondence. She went to him about something else. "I'd like to see the estate accounts," she said. He looked up from his desk. "Why, because I've been through the household accounts for the last 4 years," she said, "and there are payments going out every month to a firm I can't find any corresponding inventory for. I'd like to see whether the same pattern appears in the estate ledgers." The room was very still. Nathaniel set down his pen. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with those cool gray eyes, and Elizabeth held his gaze and did not look away, and the silence between them stretched long enough that she could hear the clock on the mantel marking the seconds. "What firm?" he said. "Hayes and Lorne Commercial," she said. "Out of Richmond." Something happened in his face. It was barely there, a tightening around the eyes, a slight shift in the set of his jaw. But she had been watching his face carefully for 6 weeks by now, and she caught it. "I've used Hayes and Lorne for estate transactions before," he said evenly. "Caroline recommended them." "I'm sure she did," Elizabeth said. Another pause. He heard what was underneath her words, the thing she was not saying directly. She watched him hear it. "Elizabeth," he said, and his voice had dropped into that lowest register, the one she was beginning to understand, meant he was choosing every word with particular care. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," she said. "I'm asking to see the estate accounts." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened the desk drawer and took out a heavy ledger and set it on the desk between them. "Sit down," he said. She sat. They went through it together. Nathaniel turning pages, and Elizabeth reading beside him, and it took less than 20 minutes for her to find what she was looking for. The payments were there, larger than the household account entries, more frequent, going back further. The earliest one she could find was dated spring of 1811, the year Gerald Hayes had begun his own investigation. "These," she said and pointed. Nathaniel leaned forward and looked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Those are estate management fees." "For what services?" "Factor services. Caroline's late husband managed several of our off-site transactions." "Gerald Hayes died in 1813, Elizabeth said. These payments continued through 1815. Silence. "Nathaniel," she said quietly, "the payments continued for 2 years after the man who was supposedly receiving them was dead." She watched him do the arithmetic. She watched the thing she already knew settle over him slowly, the way cold water settled, working its way down through layers of trust and habit and grief-formed certainty, until it reached somewhere he hadn't wanted it to reach. "That could be an administrative error," he said. But he didn't say it the way a man says something he believes. He said it the way a man says something he's testing. "It could be," she agreed. "Would you like to find out?" He looked at her for a long, long moment. Then he said, "What do you need?" What she needed was time and access, and for Caroline to not realize what she was doing. The last part was the hardest. Caroline was in the house almost every day. She had no formal role. She was not a member of the household staff. She was not a relative. She was simply a neighbor, a widow of good standing, who had been a comfort to a grieving young man, and had never quite departed. She moved through Whitmore as though the place were a garment she had been fitted for. She knew the rhythms of the house, the staff's habits, Nathaniel's schedule, and she was watching Elizabeth. Elizabeth could feel it, that particular awareness you developed when someone was tracking your movements without appearing, to the way you felt it in the back of your neck. The way every room you entered seemed to have been slightly rearranged in your absence. So Elizabeth gave her something to watch. She started spending her afternoons in the parlor with her embroidery, the way she had been doing since the first week. She kept to the same patterns Caroline expected of her: breakfast, a morning walk, the parlor supper. She asked Caroline's opinion on small domestic matters, the kind of questions a young wife might ask a more experienced woman. She was pleasant. She was deferent. She was, to every eye that looked at her, exactly what Caroline had decided. She was a quiet, unremarkable young woman who had married above herself and knew it. In the mornings before the household woke, she went through the estate records. Nathaniel had given her a key. He had not explained to Caroline why the study was sometimes occupied when he was not in it. He had not, as far as Elizabeth could tell, said anything to Caroline at all. This told her something about him, that whatever she had said, whatever arithmetic he had done in the privacy of his own mind, he had decided to move carefully. Not to confront. Not yet. Smart, she thought. Or at least careful. In this situation, careful was enough. She worked backward through the estate accounts, building a record of every payment to Hayes and Lorne Commercial, from the earliest entry forward. She cross-referenced against the household accounts. She tracked the signature that appeared on the authorization slips, the one Gerald Hayes had written about, the one he had said he recognized but couldn't place. It took her 2 weeks. At the end of those 2 weeks, she sat back and looked at what she had built, and she felt the cold clarity again, that clean, settling feeling of a thing fully understood. The signature was Caroline's. She was certain of it. She had found 3 documents in the estate files that Caroline had signed: openly a letter of reference for a departing staff member, a record of a household delivery. She had personally accepted a note she had written to Nathaniel that had been filed with the estate correspondence. The signature was not identical to the one on the authorization slips, but it was close enough, and close in the particular way that a practiced forger, who was not quite practiced enough, left traces: the same pressure on the downstroke of the capital letters, the same slight leftward lean, the same doubled loop on the final S of Hayes. She found something else too. In a file of correspondence from 1813, the year Gerald died, the year the payments should have stopped, but didn't, there was a letter from a physician. A routine letter, the kind a household physician sent to note the details of a patient's final illness. She had almost passed over it. She had looked again because something about the letterhead caught her eye, a name she had seen somewhere else, and she spent an afternoon tracking down where. The physician's name appeared in one of Eleanor's letters. Not the bundle with Gerald's correspondence, but an older letter, a social letter, a letter recommending a physician to a friend. "He is very capable." Eleanor had written, "though I confess I find his manner a little too accommodating to the wishes of his wealthier clients." Too accommodating to the wishes of his wealthier clients. Elizabeth sat with that phrase for a long time. Then she added it to her notebook, underlined twice, and went to supper. It was William who told her about the steward. She had gotten into the habit of walking with William when she checked on the stables, not asking him questions directly, just talking the way people talked when they were comfortable with each other, conversation finding its own direction. William was 22 and had grown up on the estate and knew things that nobody had thought to tell her because nobody had thought she'd care. "Mr. Aldridge is real quiet lately," William said one morning, pulling a brush through a horse's flank. "Since you and Mr. Whitmore started going through the records." Elizabeth looked up. "The estate steward." "Yes, ma'am. He's been here 15 years, real good with numbers." William kept his eyes on the horse. "Used to be real friendly with Mrs. Hayes, too. Not as much lately, though, since she started coming around less." Elizabeth felt something sharpen in her chest. "Caroline has been coming around less? Past couple weeks, yes, ma'am." William glanced at her, then away. "Reckon she noticed something changed." She had. Elizabeth had been careful, but Caroline was not a stupid woman. She had noticed the study door sometimes closed when Nathaniel was out. She had noticed perhaps a slight shift in the household's gravity. Nothing she could point to, but the kind of thing a woman like Caroline would feel before she could name it. And she had begun to withdraw. That was interesting. It was the behavior of a woman covering her tracks, putting distance between herself and the thing she'd built, or of a woman preparing to move the thing she needed to protect. "William," Elizabeth said carefully, "if someone wanted to move papers from this property, estate documents, that kind of thing, how would they do it?" William thought about it. "Couldn't take them from the study. Mr. Whitmore keeps that locked." A pause. "But there's the archive in the East Wing. Old records going back 40 years. Nobody's been in there much since—" He stopped. "Since Mrs. Whitmore died," Elizabeth finished. "Yes, ma'am." She thanked him and went back inside. She went directly to Nathaniel's study. "How is there?" And he looked up when she came in, without knocking, a thing she had never done before. He registered it. He set down his pen. "She knows," Elizabeth said. "Or she suspects. She's been coming less frequently. She may try to remove something from the East Wing archive." Nathaniel was very still. "What's in the East Wing archive that she'd want to remove?" "I don't know yet," Elizabeth said. "But your mother kept correspondence there, records going back decades. If Caroline has been doing what I believe she's been doing, there may be documentation in those records that she wants destroyed." "What exactly do you believe she's been doing?" She sat down across from him, the desk between them, and she told him. "Not everything. Not the locked room, not Gerald's letters, not yet. But the accounts, the signatures, the physician, the pattern she had built across 6 weeks of careful early morning work." She watched his face as she talked. How was a man who had trained himself to show nothing she had learned that about him by now? But there were things that moved behind his eyes when he couldn't keep them still, and she watched them move now, the slow, terrible movement of a man's certainties rearranging themselves. She had seen it in her father's face once, when a man he had trusted for years had been revealed as something else entirely. It looked like falling in slow motion. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "My mother," he said finally. "You think—" "I think Gerald Hayes died suspiciously," she said. "And I think Eleanor Whitmore died suspiciously. And I think they died within 8 months of each other, while both were investigating the same pattern of financial theft. That's what I think." The silence was enormous. "I need you to trust me," Elizabeth said. "And I need you to let me finish before she realizes how close I am." He looked at her across the desk. This woman he had married for practical reasons. This woman he had barely seen in the first weeks of her time in his house. This woman who had apparently spent those weeks building a case against the person he had trusted most in the world. And she watched him quietly and waited. "Tell me what you need," he said. What she needed was Aldridge. The estate steward had been at Whitmore for 15 years. He was 53 years old, cautious, thorough, and, as William had observed recently, very quiet. Elizabeth had not spoken to him directly in her 6 weeks at the estate. He was not part of the domestic staff, and their paths had not naturally crossed. She went to find him the next morning in the estate office behind the main house. He looked up when she came in, and something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of careful alertness, the look of a man who had been waiting for something and was now calculating whether this was it. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. He stood. "Mr. Aldridge," she said. "Please sit down. I just want to talk." He sat. She sat across from him. She looked at him steadily, and she said, "I've been going through the estate accounts." "Yes, ma'am, I heard. You've kept these accounts for 15 years, she said. "You're good at your job. That means you've seen the payments to Hayes and Lorne commercial. You've seen them continue after Gerald Hayes died. You've processed them yourself, some of them." He was very still. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, "I'm not here to accuse you of anything. I'm here because I think you may have been put in a position you didn't choose, and I think you've been carrying it alone for a long time." She paused. "I'm here to offer you a way to set it down." The silence went on long enough that she thought he was going to refuse. He stared at the desk in front of him, and his jaw was tight, and she could see him doing the same arithmetic she'd watched Nathaniel do, measuring what it cost against what it cost to keep going. Then he looked up. "She told me they were continuing business arrangements," he said. "After Gerald died. She told me Gerald had set them up in advance. I had no reason not to believe her. She was his widow. She had the relevant paperwork. Everything looked legitimate." "When did you start to suspect it wasn't?" "When I compared the firm's documentation against the Richmond Merchant Registry," he said. "About 6 months after Gerald died. The firm wasn't registered the way she said it was. The founding date was wrong. The registered agent was listed as G. Hayes, but the secondary signature on the registration document was a woman's hand." He stopped. "I should have come forward then." "Why didn't you?" He looked at her. "Because 2 months before I found that Gerald Hayes died of a very sudden fever." He said it flatly, like a man reciting a fact he had memorized because he needed to remember it exactly. "And 8 months after I found it, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore died on the back stairs." The air in the room was very heavy. "I was afraid," he said. "I have a wife and 3 children. I was afraid." Elizabeth nodded. "I understand," she said. "I need you to write down everything you've just told me. Every detail, every date, everything you remember about the documents, the payments, the conversations. Can you do that? Will it?" He stopped, started again. "Will it protect my family?" "I can't promise you what I can't control," she said honestly. "What I can tell you is that the truth is going to come out. The only question is whether you're on the right side of it when it does." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Give me until tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll be here at 7, she said. She found Martha waiting for her on the path back to the main house. The housekeeper fell into step beside her without preamble, the way Martha always moved directly, without wasting time on ceremony. "Caroline was here this morning," Martha said quietly. "Before you were up. She went to the east wing." Elizabeth stopped walking. "Did she go in?" She tried. "The archive is locked." A pause. "She asked me for the key." "What did you tell her?" "That I didn't know where it was." Martha kept her eyes forward. "That was the first lie I've told in 30 years in this household, so I'd appreciate if we moved quickly." "She'll come back," Elizabeth said. "Yes, she will." They walked in silence for a moment. "Martha," Elizabeth said, "I need the archive open tonight, before she comes back." Martha reached into her apron pocket and produced a second key, smaller than the first, with a slightly worn edge. "I had a feeling," she said. Elizabeth took the key. She looked at the woman who had served this family for 30 years, who had watched a woman die on stairs. She walked every day, who had kept a key for 4 years, waiting for the right person. "Thank you," Elizabeth said, "for waiting." Martha's expression didn't change, but she gave a single short nod that said more than a sentence could have. The East Wing archive told the rest of the story. Elizabeth spent 3 hours in there that night working by candlelight, moving through boxes and files with the quiet, systematic focus she'd inherited from her father. She found what she was looking for in the third cabinet, a set of folders that had been sorted and resorted, and then at some point hastily returned to a state that tried to look untouched. She found copies of the authorization slips that had gone through the estate accounts. She found correspondence between Gerald Hayes and a Richmond solicitor, a lawyer Gerald had apparently contacted to advise him on what to do with what he'd found. The solicitor's replies were careful and slightly alarmed. The final letter, dated 2 weeks before Gerald's death, said, "I strongly advise you to bring these documents directly to the relevant authorities, rather than confronting the party involved. If your suspicions are correct, the risk to yourself is significant." Gerald Hayes had apparently not taken that advice. And then there was the letter she had not known to look for. At the back of the cabinet, in a leather folder with Eleanor Whitmore's initials pressed into the cover, she found a letter dated October 1813, 4 months before Eleanor died. It was addressed to her personal attorney in Richmond, and it laid out in Eleanor's careful, precise handwriting everything she had found: the false firm, the forged authorizations, the signature she had identified, the connection to Gerald's death, which she wrote about carefully using legal language, the language of a woman who had thought hard about what she could prove versus what she suspected. "I believe Caroline Hayes has been conducting a systematic theft of Whitmore estate funds for a period of no less than 3 years, using a firm fraudulently registered in her late husband's name. I further believe that Gerald Hayes discovered this, and that his death, while ruled as natural by the attending physician, may have been assisted. I have not yet shared this information with my son, as I do not wish to burden him without conclusive proof, and as I am not certain the full circle of those involved does not extend further. I am committing this account to you for safekeeping, and asking that should anything happen to me before I complete my investigation, you act on this information in whatever legal capacity you are able. Should anything happen to me." 4 months later, Eleanor Whitmore fell on the back stairs. The solicitor Elizabeth noted had not acted. She didn't know why yet. She didn't need to know why tonight. She had what she needed. She stood in the East Wing archive with Eleanor Whitmore's letter in her hand and the candle burning low, and she understood fully and completely the shape of the thing she was looking at. 2 people had died. A family had been bled for years. A man had been grieving for the wrong reasons, protected by the person who had caused his grief, unable to see clearly, because the person he was looking through had been the lens. And Caroline Hayes was coming back tomorrow for a key that wouldn't do her any good, because the woman she had underestimated had already been inside. Elizabeth carefully placed Eleanor's letter at the top of the stack of documents she was taking with her. She organized the rest, making sure everything was documented and ordered, and she thought as she worked about timing, because this was not something she could simply walk into Nathaniel's study with and set on his desk. This was bigger than Nathaniel's study. This was the kind of truth that needed to be witnessed. The kind that needed to happen in public in front of people who could not later be told it had been a misunderstanding, an exaggeration, a young wife making accusations against a respectable widow out of jealousy or spite. She needed the right moment. She had been patient for 6 weeks. She could be patient a little longer. She locked the archive behind her and walked back through the dark corridor, and when she got to her room, she set the documents on her desk and looked at them in the candlelight. This stack of paper, this weight of truth, and she felt something she hadn't quite let herself feel yet. Not relief, not triumph. Something quieter and more certain than either of those. The knowledge that she was ready, that when the moment came, and it was coming, she could feel it, the way you felt a storm in the air before the first cloud appeared. She would not hesitate, she would not be silent, and she would not be alone. Caroline came back the next morning. Elizabeth was at breakfast when she heard the footsteps in the east corridor, that particular rhythm she had memorized over 6 weeks, the even, unhurried pace of a woman who moved through spaces as though they belonged to her. She kept her eyes on her coffee cup and did not move. Caroline appeared in the breakfast room doorway, looking perfectly composed, dressed in green today, her hair arranged without a single strand out of place. She looked at Elizabeth. She looked at the table. She looked briefly at the window, and then back at Elizabeth. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," Elizabeth said. "Coffee." Caroline sat down. She poured her own coffee. She was quiet for a moment in the particular way of a woman listening to the house around her, taking its temperature feeling for whatever had changed. "I was hoping to speak with Martha," she said finally, "about the East Wing." "Martha's with the laundry this morning," Elizabeth said. "I can help you with whatever you need." A pause. "It's nothing important." Caroline lifted her cup. "I thought I might have left some personal items there when I was helping clear out after Eleanor passed. I wanted to check." Of course. Elizabeth kept her voice warm and uncomplicated. I'm sure Martha can help you find a time later in the week. She watched Caroline process this, watched her decide whether to push, watched her decide not to. Of course, Caroline said pleasantly. There's no rush, but there was. Elizabeth could see it in the slight tension at the corners of her eyes, in the way her fingers wrapped around the coffee cup just a fraction too tightly. She had come back expecting to find a locked door. She had found Elizabeth at breakfast instead, and she didn't know yet what that meant. That uncertainty Elizabeth thought was useful. An uncertain woman made mistakes. Nathaniel found her in the study at mid-morning. She had the documents spread across his desk, organized, ordered, everything labeled in the neat hand her father had drilled into her. Eleanor's letter was at the top. Aldridge's written account was behind it. The estate account analysis was third cross-referenced with the household records, the dates aligned with arrows she had drawn in the margins, pointing to the corresponding authorization signatures. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at it. Then he came in and closed the door. He sat across from her, and she walked him through it. All of it this time: the locked room, the key, Gerald's letters, Eleanor's final letter to her solicitor. Everything Aldridge had told her. The archive, the folder with his mother's initials pressed into the leather. She laid it out in order the way she had arranged the documents, clear and precise, and without embellishment, because the facts themselves were embellishment enough. He did not interrupt her. He asked 2 questions, both quiet, both controlled, and she answered them. When she finished, he picked up his mother's letter and read it himself, slowly, all the way through. She watched his face while he read. She had been watching Nathaniel Whitmore's face for nearly 2 months, and she had gotten reasonably good at reading what moved behind it. She saw the moment the full weight of what Eleanor had written landed on him. Not the financial details, not the legal implications, but the last lines. I have not yet shared this with my son, as I do not wish to burden him without conclusive proof. She saw him absorb those words, and she saw what they cost him. His mother had been protecting him. She had died protecting him. And in the 4 years since he had been protected by the very woman who had caused that death. The grief that had made him cold, the isolation that had made him an easy target, all of it had been tended and cultivated by Caroline Hayes, who had stepped into the gap his mother's death created and made herself indispensable and irreplaceable and utterly trusted. She was in the house when my mother died, Nathaniel said. He said it very quietly, not as a question. She had been here that week, yes, Elizabeth said. According to Martha. Martha knew. Martha suspected. There's a difference. Elizabeth looked at him steadily. She didn't have proof. She didn't know what your mother had found. She knew that Eleanor Whitmore did not lose her footing on stairs. She walked every day, and she knew that 2 people who had been asking questions were dead, and she was afraid. He set the letter down. He put his hands flat on the desk and looked at them for a moment. How long? Long, he said. The earliest payment I could trace was 1811, Elizabeth said. 4 years before we married. Possibly longer, the older records are incomplete. How much? She had calculated this. She slid the accounting summary across the desk. He looked at the final figure at the bottom, and something moved through his jaw. Christ, he said softly. It was the first time she had heard him swear. She understood it. What do we do? He asked. And there it was, the question she had been building toward for 6 weeks, the question that told her everything about where they now stood. Not what do I do? Not I'll handle this. We. She pulled the document she had drafted the night before from beneath the stack and set it in front of him. We take this to the county magistrate, she said, before she realizes the archive has been accessed, before she has time to move anything else or destroy anything. We go today with the documents with Aldridge's sworn account, and we let the magistrate determine how to proceed. Nathaniel looked at the document. Then he looked at her. If we go to the magistrate, this becomes public. Yes, Elizabeth said. Everything about my mother, about how she died, about how long this went on without my knowing. Yes, she said again, and she kept her voice steady and her eyes on his because she understood what he was really asking. Whether she knew what this would cost him, not financially, but in the eyes of every man. He knew every family in the county, every person who would look at him and see a man who had been deceived for 4 years by a woman he'd trusted, while his wife of 6 weeks had been the one to find the truth. "Nathaniel," she said, "your mother died trying to protect you. She couldn't finish what she started. We can." He was very still for a long moment. Then he stood up. "Give me 20 minutes to dress," he said. "We'll take the carriage." The county magistrate's name was Warren Holt, and he was 60 years old and deeply unimpressed with most things. He received Nathaniel with the particular courtesy extended to the richest landowner in the county, and he received Elizabeth with the lesser courtesy extended to that man's wife, and he set both courtesies aside fairly quickly when he began to read what Elizabeth had placed before him. He read for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up at Elizabeth, not at Nathaniel, and said, "You compiled this yourself?" "I did," she said. He looked at the documents again. "This accounting analysis. My father was a merchant," she said. "He kept his own books. I learned to read accounts before I learned to read sheet music." Holt was quiet. He looked at the accounting summary, then at Eleanor's letter, then at Aldridge's written statement. He aligned them against each other the way a man aligned things when he was testing whether they held. "This is a serious matter," he said. "2 people are dead," Elizabeth said. "I consider it serious." Nathaniel beside her said nothing. He had been largely quiet since they left Whitmore, which she was beginning to understand was his way of thinking. He went inward when the stakes were high, processed in silence, emerged with decisions made. She had stopped expecting conversation from him on the carriage ride and had used the time to go through the documents one more time in her head. "I'll need time to review these in full," Holt said. "And I'll need to speak with your steward directly." He looked at Nathaniel. "This will require a formal proceeding, given the amounts involved and the other matter." He glanced at Eleanor's letter. "I'll need to involve the circuit court." "How long?" Nathaniel asked. 2 weeks at minimum, possibly 3. Holt's eyes moved to Elizabeth. "In the meantime, Mrs. Whitmore, these originals need to remain with me. I assume you have copies." "I made them last night," she said. He allowed himself a brief look that was almost respect. Good. They left the documents with him. They rode home in silence, and the silence was different from the silence that had existed between them for 6 weeks. Something had shifted in it. It was still quiet, still careful, but it was no longer empty. "You made copies last night," Nathaniel said finally, as they turned up the long drive. "I wasn't sure you'd agree to go to the magistrate," she said honestly. "I wanted to make sure the documents were protected either way." I was quiet for a moment. "You thought I might refuse?" "I thought you might want to handle it privately," she said, "to protect yourself, the estate." "My mother deserves better than private," he said. She looked at him. He was watching the drive ahead, his profile set and deliberate, and she thought about a man who had been grieving wrong for 4 years, grieving a death that had been made to look like an accident, guided through that grief by the woman who caused it, shaped by the loss into something colder and more isolated than he might otherwise have been. "Yes," she said quietly. "She does." This was the hardest part, keeping the secret across 2 weeks while the magistrate worked, and while Caroline moved through the house with her usual confidence, slightly warmer now, slightly more attentive to Elizabeth, as though she had recalculated something. She brought Elizabeth flowers from her garden. She offered to teach her a particular recipe that Nathaniel liked. She stopped countermanding the kitchen staff. Elizabeth accepted the flowers graciously. She learned the recipe. She said thank you and meant none of it, and she watched Caroline's warmth with the cool attention of a woman who understood that this was the most dangerous version of her, the version that thought she was winning. Because if Caroline believed she was winning, she would wait. And if she waited, the magistrate had time to work. Nathaniel helped without being asked. He appeared at supper and was pleasant and showed nothing, and Elizabeth watching him across the table, while Caroline talked and poured wine, and made herself the center of the room's gravity. Thought that she had perhaps underestimated him in a different way than she'd expected. She had thought his coldness was simply who he was. She was beginning to understand it was also a tool. On the 5th day, Aldridge came to the main house. He came to find Elizabeth, specifically appearing at the kitchen entrance in the mid-afternoon with his hat in his hands and his face tight. She brought him to a small back sitting room and closed the door. "She came to see me," he said. Elizabeth felt something sharpen in her chest. "When?" "This morning, early, before the main house was up." He turned his hat in his hands, slow circles, the nervous gesture of a man keeping himself from something worse. "She said she'd heard there was some confusion about the old estate accounts. She said she wanted to help clear it up. She said she had documentation that would explain everything." "What kind of documentation?" "She didn't say." He looked up. "Mrs. Whitmore, she knows. I don't know how much she knows, but she's not here asking me questions unless she's trying to get ahead of something." Elizabeth held his gaze. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing," he said. "I told her I didn't know what she was referring to, and that any questions about the accounts should go to Mr. Whitmore directly." A pause. "She didn't like that." "I imagine not. She smiled," he said, "the way she smiles when she's deciding something." He stopped. "I've known that smile for 6 years, Mrs. Whitmore. It's the smile she makes right before she does something you can't take back." Elizabeth stood up. "I need you to go home. Be with your family. Don't speak to her again alone. If she comes back, send for me directly." "Yes, ma'am." He stood. "And you? Are you?" "I'm fine," she said. "We're close. I just need a few more days." She said it with more certainty than she felt, because he needed it, and she went to find Nathaniel. She found Martha instead. Martha was in the upper corridor coming from the direction of the east wing, with her face arranged in its usual composed lines, but her hands were moving not nervously, but with the quick, deliberate efficiency of a woman who had been doing something and was ready to do something else. "She asked me for the east wing key again," Martha said before Elizabeth could speak. "When? 20 minutes ago." Martha's jaw was set. "I told her again I couldn't find it. She told me that was very inconvenient." A pause. "Then she asked if you'd been in the east wing recently." Elizabeth went still. "What did you say?" "I said I hadn't noticed." Martha's eyes were direct and steady. "I didn't say you hadn't." It was a careful distinction. A woman of 30 years' service making a careful distinction. "She's going to try to get into that archive tonight," Elizabeth said. "That's what I think," Martha said. "Then I need to speak with Nathaniel now." She found him in the study and told him in 3 sentences. He listened with that inward stillness he had, and then he stood up. "I'll have William watch the east corridor tonight," he said. "I want to be there," Elizabeth said. He looked at her. Something moved across his face, not the reflexive dismissal she might have expected from him 6 weeks ago, but a real consideration, the kind he brought to things he was actually thinking about rather than reacting to. "All right," he said. Caroline came at 2 in the morning. Elizabeth heard her from the chair she had placed inside the east wing corridor in the darkness where she had been sitting since midnight. She heard the careful footsteps, the slow approach of a woman trying to be quiet, and she felt her own heartbeat steady, and even as the footsteps got closer. The corridor was dark. The archive door was visible. And next to the archive door in the shadow stood Nathaniel. Caroline came around the corner and stopped. For one moment, the 3 of them were in the same dark corridor, utterly still. Then Nathaniel said very quietly, "Caroline." She turned toward his voice. Elizabeth could not see her face clearly, but she could see her posture, the way it changed, the way a woman's posture changed when the calculation she'd been running suddenly came up with a different answer. "Nathaniel." Her voice was perfectly controlled. "I couldn't sleep. I thought I might." "At 2 in the morning," he said. It was not a question. He did not raise his voice. He said it the way he said everything, with that precise, controlled quietness. But the weight behind it was different from anything Elizabeth had heard from him before. "With a set of lockpicks in your pocket." The silence that followed was absolute. "I don't know what you think you know," Caroline said. "I know what I know," Elizabeth said. Caroline turned toward her voice. And now Elizabeth could see her face, or enough of it to read in the dim light from the far window, the exact moment when Caroline understood that the game she'd been playing was over. It moved across her features the way water moved across stone, slow and certain, and leaving nothing exactly as it was before. "You have no idea what you've involved yourself in," Caroline said. She said it to Elizabeth, only to Elizabeth, and her voice had lost the warmth and the practiced pleasantry and the careful management of the past 2 months. What was left underneath was colder. "You came into this house 6 weeks ago with one dress and a hired coach, and you think you understand." "I think I understand enough," Elizabeth said. She kept her voice level. She had rehearsed this the way her father had once told her to rehearse every important conversation. Not the script, not the exact words, but the stance, the internal position from which all the words would come. She had found her stance 6 weeks ago in the carriage on the road to Whitmore, and she had not lost it since. "I understand the payments. I understand Hayes and Lorne commercial. I understand Gerald's letters, and I understand your late husband's death, and I understand Eleanor Whitmore's letter to her solicitor, which she wrote 4 months before she died. And so does Magistrate Holt, because I gave him the originals 10 days ago." Another silence. Longer this time. "The originals," Caroline repeated. Her voice was very careful now. "Every document," Elizabeth said. "Organized and cross-referenced, with a written account from Mr. Aldridge and an accounting analysis going back to 1811. You have no authority in this household. She is my wife." Nathaniel's voice cut across the corridor like a blade, flat and absolute. It was the first time Elizabeth had heard him say it that way, not as an explanation, not as a courtesy, but as a fact, the kind of fact that has weight. "And you will not speak to her that way in my house." Caroline turned back to him. Elizabeth watched her make one last calculation. She could see it the way you could see a person decide something in the stillness before they moved. "Nathaniel," she said, and her voice changed again, dropped into something softer, the voice Elizabeth had heard her use when she wanted something from him, the particular warmth she deployed like a tool. "You have to understand everything I did for this estate. Gerald was going to expose the arrangement to people who didn't understand it. Your mother was—" "My mother was trying to protect me," Nathaniel said. "Don't. She was going to bring men from Richmond who would have torn this estate apart, looking for— don't." His voice had not risen. It was still quiet. But something in it had ended. "You don't get to speak about my mother tonight." Caroline stopped. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at Elizabeth. She looked between them, this couple who had been married for 6 weeks, who should have been two strangers orbiting each other in a house full of tension, and were standing side by side in a dark corridor at 2 in the morning, because they had built something together that she had not seen coming. She had been watching the wrong thing. She had watched for jealousy, for marital coldness, for the leverage points she was used to finding in a household. She had not watched for this. "You planned this," she said to Elizabeth. "I found the truth," Elizabeth said. "You're the one who made plans." Nathaniel had. William and one of the senior fieldmen standing by in the next corridor, and they took Caroline Hayes to the spare room at the far end of the east wing and locked the door, and William sat outside it through the rest of the night while a rider went to fetch the county constable. Elizabeth sat in the kitchen with Martha and a pot of coffee, and they did not speak very much. They didn't need to. Martha poured, Elizabeth drank, and the house was quiet around them. In a way it hadn't been quiet since Elizabeth arrived. A different kind of quiet, she thought. Not the quiet of things being hidden. The quiet of things being still. At some point, Nathaniel appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked tired. He looked for the first time since she had known him like a man who had put down something very heavy and had not yet decided what to do with his hands. "Sit down," Martha said. "I'll pour you a cup." He sat. The three of them were quiet together in the kitchen, while the night moved toward morning, and Elizabeth thought about Eleanor Whitmore in this same kitchen 30 years ago, learning this house, finding her place in it, building her life here. She thought about a woman who had died trying to protect the truth and the son she loved. She thought about what it meant to finish something someone else had started. "I owe you an apology," Nathaniel said. Elizabeth looked at him. "When you arrived," he said, "the way I treated you. You came into this house and I gave you nothing. I gave you a locked door and a cold supper and 6 weeks of being invisible in your own home. And you—" He stopped. He looked at this table. "You used that time to save everything my mother died trying to save." She was quiet for a moment. "You didn't know me," she said. "You had no reason to." "That's not sufficient," he said. "It's not." He looked up at her, and she saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not the gray, cool watchfulness, not the careful management, but something raw and direct and very present. "I'd like the chance to do better." The kitchen was very quiet. Martha refilled both their cups without being asked, and then moved to the far end of the room and became very busy with something that required her complete attention. "I'd like that too," Elizabeth said. The constable arrived at first light. He was a heavy-set man named Poole, who had the look of someone who had been woken before he was ready, and was reserving judgment until he understood why. He spoke to Nathaniel first, then to Elizabeth, and he went through the documents she placed before him with the same thoroughness as Magistrate Holt, asking questions in short bursts and writing down the answers in a cramped hand. When he had heard everything, he went to the spare room. Elizabeth did not go with him. She stayed in the corridor outside and listened. She heard Poole's voice formal and matter-of-fact. She heard Caroline's voice, still controlled, still careful, feeling for angles. She was a woman who would feel for angles until there were no more angles to find. She heard the particular silence that fell when Poole told her that the magistrate was already in possession of the primary documents. Then she heard something she had not quite expected. She heard Caroline laugh. It was a short sound. Not hysteria, not defeat. Something more complex than either the laugh of a woman who had spent 20 years building something and had just been told it was gone, and found the whole thing almost funny in a way nobody else in the room would understand. "She's been here 6 weeks, Caroline said. "Ma'am," Poole began. 6 weeks, Caroline said again. "And she found everything Gerald spent 2 years looking for, and everything Eleanor spent a year trying to document." A pause. "I should have paid more attention to the accounts books." Poole's voice again firm, and then silence. Elizabeth stepped back from the door. She turned and walked back toward the entrance hall, and she stood at the foot of the staircase in the house that had become slowly and unexpectedly her home, and she let herself stand still for just a moment. She heard footsteps and turned. Nathaniel was coming across the hall, and he stopped when he saw her face. "What is it?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. And then, because she was not a woman who lied to herself about the things that moved inside her, she laughed, at the end. She said, she stopped. She found the words. She said, "I'd found in 6 weeks what Gerald spent 2 years looking for, what Eleanor spent a year documenting." He was quiet. "They both died," Elizabeth said. "And she still laughs." "She's not laughing now," he said. And it was not a comfort exactly, because it wasn't meant to be. It was just true. She nodded. She straightened. She looked up the staircase toward the east wing and thought about a locked room and a leather folder with a woman's initials pressed into the cover and 30 years of lavender in the air. "I want to go back to the locked room," she said. "Eleanor's room. I want to open the shutters." He looked at her for a moment. "I'll get the key," he said. They opened the shutters together, and the summer morning came in warm and bright and unhurried, and the room that had been sealed for 4 years, filled with light and air, and the smell of the tobacco fields from the south, and the green smell of the ridge to the north. Elizabeth stood at the window and looked out at the grounds of Whitmore Plantation, and she thought about what it meant to know a place, not the surface of it, the brick and the columns and the long oak drive, but the underneath of it, the grief and the secrets and the people who had lived and died and loved here. She thought about Eleanor Whitmore standing at this same window. She thought about what Eleanor had started and not been allowed to finish, behind her. Nathaniel stood in the doorway of his mother's room, and she could feel him behind her, the way she had learned to feel the shape of the house, not looking, but knowing. "She would have liked you," he said quietly. "My mother." Elizabeth thought about a woman who kept records and wrote letters and died before she could prove what she knew. "I think I would have liked her too," she said. The morning was fully there now, The light moving across the room's old familiar surfaces, and the smell of lavender had become something softer. Not the smell of a closed room, but the smell of a place that had finally been let breathe. Elizabeth turned from the window. She looked at Nathaniel in the doorway. She thought about 6 weeks ago, the hired coach, the long drive, the single gray dress, the conversation she had had with herself on the road, about reasonable decisions and practical arrangements, and the things a woman did when the alternatives ran out. She thought about how entirely that woman would not have recognized this morning. "We should get back," she said. "Poole will have questions." "He will," Nathaniel agreed. But neither of them moved for another moment, standing in the room where Eleanor Whitmore had written her last letters, where the truth had been kept safe long enough to survive. Then Elizabeth walked toward the door, and Nathaniel stepped aside to let her through, and they went back into the corridor together, and the door behind them stayed open. Constable Poole left Whitmore Plantation at 8:30 in the morning, with Caroline Hayes in a covered carriage and a sealed box of documents riding beside him. And the whole thing was quiet enough that only the house staff saw it happen. That was intentional. Elizabeth had asked Poole the night before to make the departure as unremarkable as possible. Not to protect Caroline, she had no interest in that, but because she understood something about the county they lived in, about the way information moved through it, about the difference between news that arrived with shape and order, and news that arrived wild and garbled, and available for anyone to interpret however they chose. The circuit court proceeding would be public. That was coming, and she knew it, and she had made her peace with it. But the arrest, if that was what it was, the formal, if polite, removal of a woman from a household that could be quiet. That could be handled with dignity. She mentioned this to Nathaniel. He had looked at her for a long moment and said, "You're more careful than I expected." "I'm exactly as careful as the situation requires," she said. And then, because she was still learning how to speak to him without measuring every word first, "I was also thinking about your reputation, and the estates, and the fact that we're going to need the county's goodwill in the months ahead, not their appetite for scandal." He had nodded. He had gone to speak to Poole. And now the carriage was gone down the long drive, and Whitmore Plantation was quiet in the early morning, and Elizabeth stood on the front portico and listened to the tobacco fields and thought about what came next. What came next was harder than what had come before. What had come before was a puzzle difficult, dangerous in its way, requiring patience and precision, and a willingness to move through her own fear without letting it move her off course. But a puzzle had an answer. You worked toward it, and when you found it, the working was done. What came next was not a puzzle. What came next was rebuilding something that had been broken in some cases for years, possibly for decades. And rebuilding was slower than solving, and it required a different kind of strength. Not the cold clarity she'd relied on for 6 weeks, but something warmer and less certain and considerably harder to control. She was not sure she was ready for it. She was going to do it anyway. Nathaniel came out and stood beside her. He did not say anything for a moment. He stood the way he stood when he was thinking, very still. Weight settled, looking out at something she couldn't see. She had come to recognize this in him, the particular quality of his silences. They were not the silences of a man who had nothing to say. They were the silences of a man who had too much and was choosing carefully. "I need to understand something," he said. "All right," she said. "The solicitor." He meant Eleanor's solicitor, the man who had received her final letter, the man she had asked to act if something happened to her. He didn't. He received that letter, and he knew she was dead 8 months later, and he did nothing. "I know." "Why?" He turned to look at her. She trusted him. She sent him everything. He had it in writing, her suspicions, the documentation, the names. And he sat on it. Elizabeth had thought about this in the night. She had a few answers, none of them satisfying, all of them true. "He may have been afraid," she said. "The same way Aldridge was afraid. The same way Martha was afraid." Caroline's reach was longer than people realized. Gerald Hayes died suddenly. Eleanor died suddenly, and anyone who'd been paying attention understood that proximity to the truth was dangerous. "That's one possibility," Nathaniel said. "The other," Elizabeth said, "is that he didn't believe her. Not entirely. She was a woman writing letters about financial fraud and possible murder, and it was 1813, and the man she was accusing was a well-regarded widow who had the trust of the county's most powerful family. She paused. Men find it very easy not to believe women who are telling them inconvenient things. Nathaniel was quiet. "You didn't believe me at first," she said. "Not as an accusation, as a fact offered plainly." "No," he said, "I didn't." He looked back at the drive. "When you came to me about the accounts the first time, I thought you were making trouble. I thought you were a young wife feeling displaced and looking for something to blame on someone." He stopped. "I was wrong." "You came around," she said. "You made it impossible not to," he said. And there was something in his voice when he said it, not quite humor, not quite admiration, but something in that direction, something that sat between the two and was warmer than either. "You put the ledgers in front of me and made me look." "That's all I did," she said. "The rest of it was already there." "No," he said. "The rest of it was there, but nobody else was going to find it. You found it because you decided to look, and you decided to look because—" He stopped again, started again. "Why did you look in the beginning, before you knew any of it? What made you start?" She thought about the first morning. The key in Martha's apron pocket that hadn't been given yet. The breakfast table with Caroline pouring wine like it was her house. The kitchen and the maid called Bess, and the correction delivered over Elizabeth's head as though she were furniture. "Because someone needed to," she said. "And I was the one who was there." The circuit court date was set for 3 weeks out. Those 3 weeks were the strangest of Elizabeth's life, stranger in their way than the 6 weeks of investigation that had preceded them, because now the house knew what it was dealing with and was trying to figure out what to do with the knowing. The staff, all of them, even the ones who had deferred most completely to Caroline, reorganized themselves around Elizabeth with a kind of quiet collective efficiency that moved her. Nobody made speeches. Nobody came to her with declarations of loyalty or outpourings of relief. Martha simply began briefing her each morning on the household's needs, and the cook began checking with her on the week's menus, and the kitchen maids began looking to her when questions arose the way they should have looked to her from the first week. It was, Elizabeth thought, one of the most generous things anyone had done for her, to simply begin without ceremony, to treat her as what she had always been. Bess found her one afternoon in the parlor and stood in the doorway with her apron twisted in her hands. "Can I say something, ma'am?" "Of course," Elizabeth said. Bess came in. She was still barely 17, still slightly too young for her face to have settled into what it would become, but she stood straight. "When you told Mrs. Hayes my wages wouldn't be docked," she said, "the first time, I didn't know then what you were doing, what you were finding out." She stopped. "I just wanted you to know I never forgot it, even on the days when I didn't understand." Elizabeth looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you, Bess." "Yes, ma'am." Bess started to leave, then she stopped. "My ma used to say you can tell a person's character by how they treat someone who can't do anything for them in return." She nodded once quickly and left. Elizabeth sat alone in the parlor for a while after that. She thought about her mother who had said something similar. She thought about her father who had believed in people who did not deserve it and had paid for it and had still somehow never become someone who stopped believing. She thought about the Carter family house in Richmond, sold at a loss to cover debts that were not all of her father's making, and about riding away from it the last time with her single gray dress in her trunk, and the knowledge that the world was not arranged fairly, and the only thing you could do about it was refuse to arrange yourself around the unfairness. She thought about the fact that she had done that. She thought about the fact that it had worked. Nathaniel changed. She noticed it the way you noticed weather changing, not a single moment, but an accumulation of moments, each one small, the sum of them undeniable. He stopped disappearing into his study immediately after supper. He began lingering at sometimes an hour, talking about the estate, not reporting to her, not informing her, but talking the way you talk to someone whose opinion you were interested in. He asked her questions. He listened to her answers. He disagreed with her twice in the first week about matters related to the estate's recovery, Once about the timeline for bringing in an outside accountant. Once about which of the Whitmore business partnerships needed to be renegotiated first, and both times he made his case, and heard her counter, and adjusted his position, and neither time did he make her feel that her adjustment was tolerated rather than considered. How was not? She was clear-eyed about this, a transformed man. He was still quiet. He was still private. He still had the fundamental reserve of someone who had learned early and badly that the people closest to you could be something other than what they appeared. That reserve did not disappear because the source of it had been removed. It loosened slowly like a rope that had been held at tension for a long time and was only now being allowed to relax. But it was loosening. She noticed the first time he laughed. They were going over the estate's pending accounts, a task they had begun doing together in the evenings at the desk in his study, working side by side in a companionship that had developed without either of them quite planning it, and she had made an observation about one of their suppliers' invoices that was, she admitted, more pointed than it needed to be. She hadn't intended it to be funny. It was just true and slightly absurd the way true things sometimes were. Nathaniel Whitmore laughed, not loudly, but genuinely the real thing, sudden and unguarded there and gone before he could think to manage it. He caught himself. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the same composure she brought to everything. "You're funny," he said, as though he had just discovered this. "I've always been funny," she said. "You weren't paying attention." He almost laughed again. She saw it, the thing that moved behind his eyes, almost making it out. "No," he said. "I wasn't." The twist came on a Tuesday, 10 days before the court date. It came in the form of a letter delivered to the house in a plain envelope with a Richmond postmark addressed to Nathaniel, but marked in a corner in small letters. Elizabeth's attention also requested. Nathaniel brought it to her in the parlor and held it out without explanation. She took it and read the return address, the name of a Richmond law firm she did not recognize. "Do you know them?" she asked. "No," he said. "Open it." She did. The letter was from a partner at the firm, a man named Greer, writing on behalf of a client who had recently come forward to the firm with information related to the estate of Whitmore Plantation, specifically related to a matter now before the Albemarle County Circuit Court. The client, Greer wrote, had been in possession of certain information for some years and had not previously acted on it. He now wished to do so. The client's name was at the bottom of the letter. Elizabeth read it. She read it again. Then she looked up at Nathaniel. "Edmund Farley," she said. Nathaniel's expression shifted. "He was my mother's solicitor," he said. "Eleanor's solicitor. The man who had received her final letter. The man who had not acted." "I wants to meet," Elizabeth said. She read the relevant section aloud. "My client wishes to convey his sincere regret for the delay in coming forward, and to offer in full cooperation with the ongoing proceedings. The original correspondence he received from the late Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, along with additional documentation that he believes is directly relevant to the Circuit Court's determination." Silence. "Additional documentation," Nathaniel said. "That's what it says." He sat down slowly in the chair across from her. "She sent him more than the letter we found," he said. "It appears so." Elizabeth looked at the letter again. "It appears she sent him considerably more." They looked at each other across the parlor. This room, that had been Caroline's domain, where Elizabeth had sat with her embroidery for 6 weeks, listening and learning, and the weight of what the letter represented, settled between them. Eleanor Whitmore had not left one letter with one solicitor. She had been more careful than that. She had left a full record enough that even without what Elizabeth had found in the locked room and the archive, there was a case. Had been a case for 3 years. "Why now?" Nathaniel said. "Why come forward now?" Elizabeth thought about Aldridge and his wife and his 3 children, and the particular calculus of a person who knows the truth and has chosen silence and carries the weight of that choice every day, until the day comes when someone else makes the choice they couldn't. "Because we moved first," she said. "Because the documents are already with Magistrate Holt, and the constable has already taken Caroline, and the circuit court date is already set, and he knows that if he comes forward now before the proceedings, it looks like courage." She paused. "And maybe it is. A little. It's also self-preservation. But both things can be true. Nathaniel looked at the letter in her hands. My mother trusted him, he said. Your mother was not wrong to, Elizabeth said, and she made herself believe it as she said it because it was also true. She trusted him with the truth. The truth survived. It just needed someone to finally make it impossible to ignore. She looked at him. We made it impossible to ignore. He was quiet for a moment. Write back, he said. Tell him we'll meet him in Richmond before the court date. I'll write today, she said. They met Edmund Farley in his Richmond offices on a Thursday morning 3 days before the circuit court proceeding. He was 65 years old, gray-haired with the slightly collapsed look of a man who had been carrying something too long. He stood when they came in, and he looked at Elizabeth with an expression she had seen before in different forms, the expression of a man encountering something he had not quite prepared himself for. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I owe you an apology. You owe it to your client's memory, she said, but I'll accept it on her behalf. Something in him settled. He gestured them to chairs. He sat. The additional documentation was substantial. Eleanor had sent Farley copies of the estate payment records she had managed to access cross-referenced with notes in her own hand. She had sent him the name of the physician, the one Elizabeth had found mentioned in the old letter, the one whose name appeared on Gerald Hayes's death certificate. She had sent him a separate account of her own suspicions regarding her death should this occur, she had written, and should you receive no further correspondence from me. Please understand that this account should be treated as my final testament regarding these matters, laying out in calm, careful detail exactly what she believed Caroline Hayes was capable of and why. It was, Elizabeth thought, the document of a woman who knew she was in danger and had organized her mind around that knowledge and produced something extraordinary in the time she had left. She read it at Farley's desk while Nathaniel sat beside her, and Farley sat across from them, and nobody said anything for a long time. When she finished, she set it down. She took one breath. She knew, Elizabeth said. She knew she might not survive long enough to bring it to the court herself. She knew, Farley confirmed. He looked older than 65. He looked like a man who had known something for 3 years and had gotten no younger carrying it. I should have acted. I have told myself many things over the years about why I didn't. About the risk. About the evidence not being sufficient. About the right moment. He stopped. There was no right moment. I was afraid. Elizabeth looked at him. She thought about what it would have meant for Eleanor, for Gerald's memory, for Nathaniel's 4 years of grief-shaped isolation, if this man had been braver in 1813. She allowed herself to feel that for one moment fully. Then she set it down. You're here now, she said. With everything she gave you. We'll use it. The circuit court convened on a Friday morning in late August. The courtroom was in the county, a formal room with high windows and long benches, and a judge's bench at the front that held Circuit Judge Amos Riley, who was 70 years old and had the look of a man who had heard most things and been surprised by very few of them. Nathaniel had told her the proceedings would attract attention. He had understated it. The benches were full before the session opened, half the county's leading families. It seemed drawn by the news that had moved through the community over the preceding 2 weeks with the particular speed of information that people can't help repeating. Not the details, not yet, but the shape of it. Something had happened at Whitmore. Something involving Caroline Hayes. Something involving the new wife. Elizabeth sat beside Nathaniel at the front. She sat straight. She did not look at the gallery. She had worn her best dress, not the gray one, but a deep blue she had purchased in the county seat the week before, because she was not a woman who went into battle in the armor she'd arrived in. Magistrate Holt was there. Constable Poole was there. Edmund Farley was there with his documents. Aldridge was there with his written account and the steadiness of a man who had finally set down something heavy. Martha was there. Elizabeth had asked her, and she had come without hesitation, sitting in the gallery, with her hands folded, and her face composed, and her 30 years of knowledge about Eleanor Whitmore held ready. Caroline was there, seated with a lawyer. Elizabeth had not seen before a man who had the look of someone who had reviewed the evidence and was making the best of a difficult situation. She was impeccably dressed. She was composed in the way Elizabeth had come to recognize as Caroline's particular armor, the kind of composure that was not calm, but was performing calm well enough that the difference didn't show. Their eyes met once briefly as the session was called to order. Caroline looked at Elizabeth with an expression that had finally shed everything that wasn't real. The warmth was gone. The management was gone. What was left was something colder and strangely almost more honest, the face of a woman who had built an edifice over years and was watching someone dismantle it with what looked very much like respect for the builder. Elizabeth held the look for one moment. Then she turned to face the bench. Judge Riley called the session. Holt presented the documents. Farley presented Eleanor's full record. The judge read in extended silence that made the gallery very still. Then he asked questions. He asked Elizabeth 3 of them, and she answered each one directly, without elaboration, without apology. He asked Aldridge 2 questions, and Aldridge answered them in the same flat, precise way he had answered Elizabeth's questions 3 weeks ago, a man reading from a record he had memorized because he needed to have it right. He asked Farley 1 question: had he received the deceased's communication in good faith and preserved it intact? Farley said yes. The judge called a brief recess. Done. During the recess, a man approached Nathaniel in the corridor. Elizabeth was standing 2 steps away and heard everything. The man was Thomas Langley, one of the county's more prominent landowners, and he had the particular manner of a man who had decided to say something uncomfortable and was going to say it directly rather than build up to it. "Whitmore," he said, "I want to be clear. Whatever the court determines today, I want you to know this doesn't change how the county regards you or the estate." Nathaniel looked at him steadily. "Thank you, Langley." "It's a damned bad business," Langley said. He looked at Elizabeth, and there was something in his look not unkind, but assessing. The look of a man revising an estimate. "Your wife found all of this herself." "She did," Nathaniel said. Langley studied Elizabeth for a moment. Then he gave a short nod, not the half nod of polite acknowledgement, but a full, deliberate thing. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "the county owes you a considerable debt." "The county owes Eleanor Whitmore a considerable debt," Elizabeth said. "She did the work first. I just finished it." Langley blinked. Then he nodded again, slower. "Yes," he said. "I suppose she did." He moved off. Nathaniel was looking at her. "You didn't have to say that," he said. "Yes, I did," she said. He was quiet. Then he said, "She would have liked that, being credited." "She should be credited," Elizabeth said. "She died for it." He nodded once. He looked at the courtroom doors. "Recess is almost over." "I know," she said. She straightened her dress. She looked up at him. He was watching her with those gray eyes, and they were not cool today. They were not the managed, watchful eyes she had first seen across a supper table 6 weeks ago. They were the eyes of a man who was looking at someone he had almost failed to see and was making sure now not to miss anything. "Ready," he said. "I've been ready," she said. "Let's go in." Judge Riley ruled in under an hour. The financial fraud case against Caroline Hayes was confirmed as a matter for formal criminal prosecution to be transferred to the Richmond Circuit with the full documentation. The matter of Gerald Hayes's death and Eleanor Whitmore's death was referred to a special inquiry, not a trial, not yet, but a formal investigation with the power to compel testimony and examine the physician whose name had appeared in Eleanor's records. It was not everything. Elizabeth had not expected everything in a single Friday morning. But it was enough. It was enough that when the session ended and the gallery began to move and the corridor filled with voices, the shape of the truth had been spoken aloud in a formal proceeding entered into the court's record, made impossible to argue away or quietly ignore. Eleanor Whitmore's name had been said. Gerald Hayes's name had been said. The amounts that had been stolen had been entered into the record. The truth was public. Nobody could take it back. She stood in the corridor after and let the crowd move around her, and she felt Nathaniel beside her, not touching, not speaking, just beside her. And the difference between beside and behind and beside and in front of was something she was still learning, still finding the exact shape of. But this felt right. This felt like what she'd wanted without knowing she'd wanted it since the hired coach turned up the long drive at Whitmore 8 weeks ago. "Lizzie," he said. She looked up at him. He had not used her given name before. Not once in 8 weeks. He had said Elizabeth with careful precision, and Mrs. Whitmore and company, and on 1 or 2 occasions, simply nothing at all. Lizzie. The way her father had said it. The way only people who were allowed to said it. She did not point any of this out. She just looked at him and waited. "I'd like to take you to supper," he said. "Not at the estate, somewhere else. Somewhere that doesn't have the weight of the last 6 weeks in every room." She thought about that. She thought about how long it had been since she had been anywhere that didn't have the weight of the last 6 weeks in it. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." They went to a tavern on the county seat's main street, the kind of place that served good food without requiring ceremony, and they sat across from each other for the first time without a desk or documents between them. Nathaniel ordered for both of them without asking, and then looked at her and said, "Or would you prefer something different?" "What you ordered is fine," she said. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table, and she recognized the shape of his silence. Silence now. This was the one that meant he was going to say something he hadn't fully worked out how to say yet. She waited. "I want to tell you something about my mother," he said. "All right," she said. "She used to say—" He stopped. He tried again. "She had a thing she said when I was young, when I'd done something wrong. Not the lecture, not the consequences. Afterward, when all that was done, she'd sit with me and she'd say, 'Now, what did you learn that you couldn't have learned any other way?'" He looked up. She believed that some things only came from getting it wrong first. Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "What did you learn?" He held her gaze. He said it plainly the way he said everything when he had finally decided to say it, "That I have been looking at this house and this estate and this life for 4 years through a lens that was handed to me by a woman who wanted me to see it her way. And I stopped questioning it because the grief made it easier not to question things." He paused. "I missed my mother, and Caroline gave me a version of the household that functioned and made sense and asked nothing of me except that I keep trusting her. And I did." Another pause. "I almost lost everything my mother died trying to protect, because I stopped paying attention." "You weren't the only one she deceived," Elizabeth said. "No, but I was the one who should have been paying closest attention, and I wasn't." He looked at her. "And then you arrived, with your one gray dress and your father's accounting habits and 6 weeks of getting up before the house woke, and you paid the attention I should have been paying for 4 years. Elizabeth looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up. "You paid attention when it counted," she said. "When I brought you the ledgers, you looked. When I asked for the magistrate, you came. When I told you about Aldridge and the archive, you acted." She held his gaze. A man who didn't pay attention wouldn't have done any of those things. He was quiet. "You were in pain," she said. "And someone took advantage of that. That's not the same as not paying attention. That's being human." The food came. They ate. They talked, really talked the way they had not quite managed in 8 weeks of living under the same roof, because there had always been something between them. The investigation, the secrets, the performance of normalcy, they'd both been maintaining for different reasons. Now, there was nothing between them, and what Elizabeth found in the space that opened up was someone she had not expected, a man who was funny in the same dry, understated way she was, who had strong opinions about things he'd thought carefully about, and almost no opinions about things he hadn't, who loved the estate, not because it was powerful, but because it was his mother's and his grandfather's, and because it sat on a ridge above a river. And in the summer, the fields were the kind of green that made you understand why people stayed. They stayed at the tavern long past supper. When they finally walked out into the August evening, the air still warm, the main street quiet. Nathaniel offered her his arm. It was a formal gesture, the kind you made in polite society, but he made it differently from how he would have made it 6 weeks ago. There was something deliberate in it, something that was asking, not just offering. She took his arm. They walked to the carriage in the warm Virginia evening, and she thought about what it meant to have arrived somewhere you hadn't planned to go and found it against all expectation exactly right. "Martha will have strong opinions about us being out this late," she said. "Martha has strong opinions about everything," he said. "She's usually right." "Invariably," he agreed. "It's very inconvenient." She laughed. It came out easier than she expected. Real laughter, the kind that didn't have to be checked first. He looked at her when she laughed, and she saw it again. That thing behind his eyes that was not quite warmth yet, but was the place warmth came from, the source of it, opening up. "I want to start over," he said. Not dramatically, just plainly. "Not all of it. I don't think either of us would survive starting all of it over. But the parts that were wrong from the beginning, I want to do them differently." Elizabeth looked up at him. She thought about the hired coach and the cold supper and 6 weeks of being invisible in her own home. She thought about a locked door and a housekeeper's key and 2 dead people's courage making it all the way forward to this moment. "I don't want to start over," she said. He went still. "I want to go forward," she said. "From here, from what we've already built." She held his gaze. "We built something, Nathaniel. You may not have realized it while it was happening, but we did." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "We did." The carriage was waiting. The drive back to Whitmore stretched ahead of them through the warm summer dark, through the fields that were his mother's and his grandfather's, and now in some way neither of them had fully named yet theirs. Elizabeth settled into the carriage seat. Nathaniel sat beside her, not across beside, and the carriage moved off down the road, and she thought about the long drive 8 weeks ago in a hired coach with her single gray dress and the story she had been telling herself about reasonable decisions. She thought about how entirely she had underestimated what was waiting for her at the end of that drive. She thought, well, now you know better. She closed her eyes just for a moment and let the carriage carry them home. The carriage ride back to Whitmore that night lasted just under an hour, and by the time the wheels turned up the long oak drive, Elizabeth had made 3 decisions. The first was that she was going to write to her father in the morning. A real letter, not the careful managed correspondence she had been sending since the wedding, the kind designed to reassure without revealing, to maintain the appearance of a daughter doing well without burdening a man who already carried too much. A real letter. She was going to tell him what had happened, all of it, and she was going to tell him that she was all right, and she was going to mean it. The second was that she was going to ask Martha to open all the remaining shuttered rooms in the East Wing, not just Eleanor's room, all of them. The house had been living with its windows half closed for 4 years, and that was long enough. The third decision she kept to herself for now, because it involved Nathaniel, and she had learned in the past 8 weeks that the decisions involving Nathaniel were best approached the way you approached something you wanted to last, carefully, with attention to the ground beneath your feet. She told him the first 2 decisions as they stepped down from the carriage. He listened. "Write to your father," he said. "Tell him whatever you need to tell him." A pause. "And tell him that if he wants to visit, he's welcome at Whitmore." She looked at him. "He's your father," Nathaniel said. "He should see where his daughter lives." It was not a grand gesture. It was not a speech. It was just a sentence offered plainly, the way he offered most things, now that he had stopped managing every word before it left his mouth. And it moved her more than a speech would have, the way the plain things always did. "Thank you," she said. They went inside. Martha was waiting in the entrance hall, which surprised neither of them. She looked at their faces and read them the way she had been reading the faces of people in this house for 30 years. And whatever she found there, she allowed herself the smallest shift in her expression. Not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one. The thing a woman who had been carrying grief and vigilance for 4 years allowed herself when she determined that the weight had finally been set down. "Supper's been kept warm," she said, "though I reckon you already ate." "We did," Elizabeth said, "but I could do with tea." "I'll bring it up," Martha said. She started to turn. Then she stopped. She turned back and she looked at Elizabeth with those direct, measured eyes, and she said, "I'm glad you came." 3 words. No embellishment. "So am I," Elizabeth said. Martha went to make the tea. The letter to Thomas Carter went out the next morning, and his reply came back in 6 days, which meant he had written it the same afternoon he received hers. Elizabeth read it alone in her sitting room, the room that had always been hers and had never quite felt like it until now. Her father's handwriting was the same as it had always been, slightly rushed, slightly uneven, the handwriting of a man whose thoughts moved faster than his pen, and the letter was short because he had never been a man who used words to fill space. "My dear Lizzie," it said, "I have read your letter 3 times. I am not ashamed to tell you that I wept at parts of it. I am ashamed to tell you that most of what I wept about was my own failures, that I put you in a position that required such courage of you that I could not give you more choices than the one you took. But I find I cannot stay ashamed long, because what you did with the one choice you had is not a thing that leaves room for shame. Your mother would have been so proud. I will come at the end of September if that suits. P.S. You always were the one who paid attention. I should have said so more." She folded the letter. She held it in both hands for a moment. Then she got up and went to find Nathaniel because there were estate accounts to review and correspondence to draft, and an outside accountant arriving from Richmond the following week, and there was a great deal of work still to be done. She had always preferred working to sitting still. The special inquiry into Gerald Hayes's death and Eleanor Whitmore's death opened in Richmond in the first week of September. They attended together, Elizabeth and Nathaniel, riding to Richmond in the Whitmore carriage with Farley's documents and Aldridge's account, and in a leather satchel that Nathaniel held on his lap for most of the journey, his mother's folder with her initials pressed into the cover. He had asked the night before they left if he could read the rest of Gerald's letters. The ones Elizabeth had found in the locked room. She had given them to him without comment and left him alone with them. He had come to find her 2 hours later, and his face was the face of a man who had been somewhere difficult and come back carrying something new. She was so careful, he said. Every letter she kept, every note she made, she was building something she knew might outlast her. He stopped. She was doing what you did, just alone, without anyone to help her. She had Gerald, Elizabeth said. For a while. Until she didn't. He looked at the folder in his hands. She knew she was running out of time and she kept going anyway. Yes, Elizabeth said. She did. He nodded slowly. He set the folder on the desk between them, and his hand rested on it for a moment. Not the gesture of a man putting something away, but of a man making a promise. "We're going to finish it," he said. "We already started," she said. The Richmond inquiry was presided over by a 3-judge panel, and it was considerably more formal than the Albemarle County Circuit. Preceding a higher room, a larger gallery, a weight to the proceedings that sat differently in the chest. Elizabeth had expected to feel afraid walking into it. She felt something else instead clear. The same clarity she had felt in the candlelit archive with Eleanor's letter in her hand, the feeling of a thing fully understood. The inquiry took 3 days. On the first day, Farley presented Eleanor's full record, including the portions he had kept for 3 years without acting on them. He presented it without embellishment, with visible difficulty, and without asking for any accommodation of his own delay. The panel questioned him for 2 hours. He answered everything. On the second day, a physician from Charlottesville, not the physician named in Eleanor's records, who had been located and was cooperating separately with the inquiry, gave testimony about the documented circumstances of Gerald Hayes's final illness. His testimony was technical, careful, and in several places devastating. He used the word inconsistent 3 times each time in reference to the documented progression of Gerald's supposed fever versus the timeline of his decline. He used the word unusual 4 times. He did not use the word poison, but by the time he finished, the word had been constructed from every other word around it, and the gallery understood. Elizabeth sat beside Nathaniel through all of it, and she did not look at the gallery. She looked at the panel and at the witnesses, and occasionally at Nathaniel's hands, which were still and flat on his knees, in the way they were when he was holding himself very carefully together. On the second afternoon during a recess, he said to her, "I keep thinking about the last time I saw her, before she died. We argued about something I can't even remember now, something small, estate business. She wanted to handle something differently. I wanted to do it my way." He stopped. "I didn't go back for 3 weeks, And then she was gone. Elizabeth looked at him. She did not offer comfort that would have been easy, but false. "You couldn't have known," she said. "You didn't know there was a clock running." "No, but I could have gone back sooner anyway." He looked straight ahead. "Not because of the clock, just because she was my mother." She said nothing. Sometimes the true thing was not the comforting thing, and a man needed to sit with it. After a moment, she put her hand over his. He turned his hand palm up and held hers. They stayed that way until the recess ended. The third day brought the twist that Elizabeth had not seen coming. She had thought she knew the shape of everything by now. She had spent 8 weeks building a picture, adding pieces, cross-referencing and verifying, until she was confident the picture was complete. She had been in this confidence slightly wrong. The third day brought a woman named Ruth Alderman. Ruth Alderman was 47 years old, and she was introduced to the panel as a former household employee of Gerald and Caroline Hayes, who had left their employ in 1812 and relocated to a town 2 counties over. She had her attorney explained, come forward after reading an account of the inquiry in a Richmond paper. She had been Caroline's lady's maid for 4 years. She knew things. Elizabeth heard Nathaniel's breath change beside her when Ruth Alderman began to speak. She felt her own hands go very still in her lap. Ruth Alderman told the panel that in the winter of 1812, she had been sent by Caroline to deliver a package to a man whose name she remembered because it had appeared again later on Gerald Hayes's death certificate. The man was the physician. The package was small and wrapped in brown paper, and Ruth had not known what was in it. She had thought at the time that it was medicine her mistress had mentioned that Gerald had been unwell. She had not thought about it again until she read Gerald Hayes's name in a Richmond paper connected to this inquiry and understood that the unwell had become something else. "I should have come forward sooner," Ruth Alderman said. Her voice was steady and her hands were folded, and she looked at the panel without flinching. "I was afraid. And then time passed, and I was afraid I'd waited too long that nobody would believe me." She paused. "But I couldn't read about it and stay quiet. Not again." The panel asked her 12 questions. She answered every one. Elizabeth sat in her chair and thought about all the people who had known pieces of this and stayed quiet out of fear. Aldridge, Martha Farley, Ruth Alderman, each one carrying a fragment of the truth for years, unable to see how their fragment fit with the others, how together they made something that could not be argued away. She had not gathered them. She had not known about Ruth Alderman. She had not orchestrated this. What she had done was start. She had moved first, and her moving had made it possible for others to move, and their moving had made it possible for more. And what the panel was looking at now was not one woman's 6 weeks of work, but years of suppressed truth, finally finding its way to air. She thought about Eleanor building her record alone in the locked room. She thought, you didn't fail. You just needed more time than you had. When Ruth Alderman finished, Elizabeth heard something she had not expected to hear again. The particular charged silence of a room that was holding something enormous and hadn't found a way to exhale yet. She had heard it in the East Corridor 2 nights ago, and in Magistrate Holt's office, and in the courtroom on Friday morning. She recognized it now for what it was. The moment before truth became permanent. The inquiry panel's finding came 4 days later, delivered in a formal written statement that Farley read to them in his Richmond office. Caroline Hayes was to face criminal prosecution on 3 counts: fraudulent operation of a business entity, misappropriation of estate funds across a period of no less than 4 years, and conspiracy in the administration of a substance leading to the death of Gerald Hayes. The matter of Eleanor Whitmore's death was referred for further investigation, with the panel noting that while direct evidence of Caroline's involvement remained incomplete, the pattern of conduct established in the hearing warranted continued examination. It was not everything. Caroline would have lawyers. The prosecution would take time. Not every charge would survive the full weight of a criminal proceeding. But Eleanor Whitmore's death was being investigated. Gerald Hayes's death was being named for what it was. The woman who had done it was facing a court of law. Nathaniel held the written finding for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "My mother wrote that letter 4 years ago, so this moment would be possible." Yes, Farley said quietly. She did. She planned for the possibility that she wouldn't survive to see it. He looked up. She planned for someone else to finish it. Farley nodded. He looked at Elizabeth. She could not have planned on who that would be, he said, but I suspect she would have approved. They came home to Whitmore on a Wednesday afternoon, and the house felt different in the way houses felt different when the thing they had been holding was finally released. Martha met them in the entrance hall. She looked at Nathaniel's face, and then at Elizabeth's, and she said, "It's done." "It's done," Elizabeth said. "Or it will be." Martha nodded once. Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen, and Elizabeth heard her say something not to anyone in particular, not loud enough to make out the words, and she thought it might have been a name. She thought it might have been Eleanor. She let it be private. Thomas Carter arrived at the end of September as he'd promised. He came in a hired coach. He still did not keep his own, and he stepped down in the gravel drive and looked up at Whitmore Plantation with the eyes of a man who had been worrying about his daughter for 8 months and was now being relieved of that particular weight all at once. He was 56 years old, slight gray at the temples, with the same accounting-quick mind he had passed to his daughter, and the same habit of writing things down, and the same slightly rushed handwriting, and the same refusal to use words to fill space when they could be doing something better. He looked at the house. He looked at Elizabeth, who had come out to the portico to meet him. Then he walked up the front steps and put both arms around her and held on. She held on too. "You're all right," he said. It was not a question. "I'm all right," she said. He pulled back and looked at her face with the thorough, unhurried attention of a father who had been waiting to do exactly this for most of a year. He looked for a long time. Then he said, "You look like your mother." She laughed, which surprised her. "You say that every time you see me." "Every time it's true," he said. Nathaniel came out to the portico then, and he shook Thomas Carter's hand, and Thomas Carter looked at him with the particular evaluating attention of a father who had been worrying about his daughter for 8 months and was now face to face with the situation. He asked Nathaniel 2 questions, both of them direct, neither of them unkind. Nathaniel answered both without deflection. Thomas Carter nodded slowly. "You have good land here," he said. "We do," Nathaniel said. And Elizabeth heard it, though we spoken without thinking, the kind that comes out naturally when it has already become true. Thomas Carter heard it too. He looked at Elizabeth briefly, and she saw the thing move across his face, relief primarily, and something softer underneath it. "Show me the estate," Thomas said. "I'd like to see what Lizzie's been managing." He stayed for 10 days. In those 10 days, Elizabeth watched the 2 men find each other, the way 2 careful private people found each other slowly through tasks and shared purpose, rather than conversation for its own sake, through the particular male language of problems approached and solved together. They went over the estate's recovery plan together. Thomas contributing the merchant's perspective that Nathaniel lacked. Nathaniel contributing the landowner's knowledge of the particular rhythms of Virginia soil and summer markets. They argued about 2 things pleasantly and agreed about most of everything else. On the 8th day, Thomas came to find Elizabeth in the parlor. He sat down across from her. He looked at the room, the embroidery on the side table, the account books she kept beside her chair, the small notebook she carried everywhere, the particular way the light came in from the east in the morning that she had come to rely on without realizing it. "This is your home," he said. "Yes," she said. "He treats you well." "He does," she said. "He didn't always, but he does now, and the difference between the 2 was something he came to himself. I didn't ask him to." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's the kind that sticks," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I waited." He looked at her for a moment. "Your mother used to say you probably don't remember you were very young. She used to say that the best love stories weren't the ones that started perfectly. They were the ones where 2 people who were wrong for each other in all the predictable ways turned out to be exactly right in all the ways that mattered." Elizabeth looked at her father. She thought about a hired coach and a gray dress and a long drive and a supper table with too much silence, and 6 weeks of candles burning low over account books, and a key in a housekeeper's apron, and a bundle of old letters that had waited 4 years for the right person to read them. She was a smart woman, Elizabeth said. Invariably, her father said. Where do you think you got it? The last evening of Thomas Carter's visit, Martha made a dinner that required 3 hours of preparation and produced more food than 5 people could reasonably eat, which was how Martha expressed things she did not have the language for. They ate around the large dining table, Thomas Elizabeth Nathaniel Aldridge and his wife, who had been quietly invited, and it was loud in the way that a house became loud when it had been quiet too long and had finally remembered how. After supper, Nathaniel disappeared briefly and came back with a bottle of wine from the estate's cellar, the kind kept for significant occasions. My mother bought this the year I was born, he said. She said she was keeping it for a moment worth opening it for. Thomas Carter looked at the bottle. And what's the occasion? Nathaniel looked at Elizabeth. Truth coming home, he said. Eventually. Thomas Carter accepted his glass. He turned it in his hand. Then he looked at Nathaniel and said, She picked well, my daughter. She has her mother's instincts. Nathaniel glanced at Elizabeth. She has her own, he said. Which are better? Elizabeth said, You don't have to argue about it. We're not arguing, her father said. We're agreeing. She looked between them, these two careful, private, stubborn men who had found each other over 8 days of estate accounts and pointed conversation. And she thought about how much could change in the time it took a season to turn. She had arrived at Whitmore in the heavy Virginia summer, in a gray dress in a hired coach, with a father she was trying not to worry, and a marriage she was trying not to grieve before it started. She had arrived expecting cold courtesy and reduced circumstances, and the specific loneliness of being the least important person in a room full of people who had already decided what they thought of her. She had not expected the locked room, or the key, or the letters, or the truth that had been waiting patient and dangerous for someone willing to look. She had not expected Martha, or William, or Aldridge, or Ruth Alderman, or any of the people who had been carrying pieces of something too heavy for one person to hold. She had not expected Nathaniel, not this version of him, the one who laughed unexpectedly and held her hand in a Richmond courthouse and said, "We," without thinking, and kept a bottle of wine for a moment, worth opening it for. She had not expected any of it. She raised her glass. "To Eleanor Whitmore," she said. "Who started it?" The table went quiet. Nathaniel looked at her, and something in his face moved in the way it moved when she had said exactly the right thing, and it had reached him somewhere he hadn't fully defended. "To Eleanor Whitmore," he said. "To Eleanor Whitmore," Thomas Carter said. Martha standing in the doorway because she had never in 30 years been the kind of housekeeper who sat at the table, but had also never been the kind who left entirely lifted the small glass she was holding. They drank. Thomas Carter left the next morning with a promise to return at Christmas and a handshake for Nathaniel that lasted a beat longer than handshakes usually did, which was how Thomas Carter said the things he couldn't quite find the sentence for. Elizabeth walked him to the carriage. He held her hands for a moment before he climbed in. "Right," he said. "Every week," she said. "And Lizzie." He looked at her, and he was her father again, the man who had taught her to read accounts and keep notebooks and pay attention, and never mistake silence for absence. "You did something remarkable." "I finished something remarkable," she said. "Eleanor started it." "You finished it," he said. "Don't undercount what that took." She looked at him. "I had help. The best people always do," he said. "The worst ones try to do it alone." He squeezed her hands once let go and climbed into the carriage. He looked back at her from the window as the horses moved off. He did not wave. He just looked the way he always looked when he was memorizing something. She watched the carriage down the long drive until it turned and was gone. She found Nathaniel at Eleanor's desk. He sat in the room that had been unlocked and aired, and opened the room that smelled of lavender and summer, now instead of sealed grief, and he had the leather folder open in front of him, and he was reading his mother's handwriting, and his face was very still. He looked up when she came in. She sat in the chair near the window. She didn't ask what he was reading. She could see what he was reading. She just sat. After a while, he said, "She wrote about me in here, in the middle of all the records and the documentation, just between the numbers." He looked down at the page. "She wrote, Nathaniel does not know yet the weight of what he carries. I have tried to protect him from it. But I think he is stronger than I have let him be, and I am sorry for that. He will need to be strong when the time comes." His voice did not break, but it was close. "She knew you," Elizabeth said. "She knew I could do more than I was letting myself do," he said. "And she still tried to carry it alone instead of giving me the chance to help." He looked up. "That's the part I keep coming back to. I could have helped her." "She was a mother," Elizabeth said. "Mothers protect first. It's the wrong call sometimes, but it comes from the right place." He looked at her for a long moment. "I don't want to do that," he said. "I don't want to protect first. I want to—" He stopped. He tried again carefully the way he tried things he hadn't said before. "I want a partner, someone who carries it with me, not behind me and not in front of me." Elizabeth held his gaze. "Then we're in agreement," she said, "because that's what I came here to be." Something shifted in his face all the way this time. All the managed reserve releasing at once. Not dramatically, but completely, like a door finally opening on a room that had been locked too long. "I know," he said. "I know that now." He reached across Eleanor's desk, and he set his hand on the table between them, open palm up. She looked at it. She looked at him. She thought about everything it had taken to get to this exact moment: 2 dead people's courage, and a housekeeper's key, and 6 weeks of pre-dawn candlelight, and a courtroom in Richmond, and a dinner table full of people, and a bottle of wine opened for a moment worth it. She put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, and they sat together in Eleanor Whitmore's room, while the Virginia afternoon moved outside the open window, warm and unhurried, the tobacco fields green to the south, and the ridge green to the north, the whole wide land of it, saying the same thing it always said in that quiet, iron-certain voice. "This belongs to someone. This belongs to people who stayed." Years later, when people in Albemarle County told the story of Whitmore Plantation, and they did tell it the way communities told the stories that defined them at supper tables and in parlors, and on the long rides between neighboring properties, they always began the same way. They said there was a woman who came to Whitmore in the summer of 1815 in a hired coach with one dress and her father's accounting habits, and in 6 weeks she found what a dead woman had spent a year trying to prove, and what a dead man had spent 2 years trying to document. And she walked into a Richmond courthouse and laid it in front of 3 judges and did not flinch. Some of them, the ones who had been in the courtroom that Friday morning in late August, added that she had said Eleanor Whitmore's name first. That when Nathaniel offered the toast that evening, it was Elizabeth who had spoken the name. That she had not stood at the head of the table and taken credit for something she understood had begun long before her. That was the detail people remembered. Not the documents, not the accounting analysis, not the signatures or the forged firm or the bundle of letters tied with brown string. They remembered that she had said Eleanor's name first. They remembered it because it was the kind of thing that told you who a person really was. Not the solving of the thing, not the victory, but the way she stood afterward and pointed away from herself toward the woman who had started it, and made sure that woman was not forgotten. Martha Collins lived another 18 years after that summer. She never left Whitmore. She never stopped running the household with the same composed, direct efficiency she had brought to it for 30 years. She did allow in her final years for Elizabeth to occasionally sit with her in the kitchen in the evenings and simply talk the way women who had been through something together sometimes needed to talk, and in those conversations she said things about Eleanor Whitmore that she had never said to anyone, and Elizabeth listened and remembered every word. Aldridge stayed on as a state steward for another 12 years until his oldest son was old enough to learn the role from him. He brought his written account to the Richmond proceedings every time they needed updating, and he brought it without being asked, and he brought his family to the estate's summer gatherings, and Bess, who had grown from a 17-year-old girl with flour on her apron into a steady, capable young woman, always made sure there was enough of the food he liked. Thomas Carter came at Christmas that first year, and never quite went back to Richmond to stay. He kept his small rooms there for the sake of appearances, But he spent most of his time at Whitmore in the East Wing guest room, with the good morning light, with the account books that Nathaniel had started asking his opinion on, and the long walks that the Virginia autumn made possible, and the granddaughter who arrived in the spring of 1817, and had everyone agreed. Her grandmother's eyes and her mother's attention span, and a very strong opinion about most things from a very early age. They named her Eleanor. Not dramatically, not as a monument, just as a name, the right name, the one that had been waiting. Nathaniel held his daughter for the first time and looked at the name written in the record book, and he didn't say anything, and he didn't need to. Elizabeth, watching him from the bed where she had spent the past 12 hours, being considerably more capable than she would have predicted, saw his face do the thing it did when something reached him somewhere he hadn't defended. She let it be quiet. After a long time, he looked up at her. "She would have loved this," he said. "She would have had opinions about everything," Elizabeth said. "Strong ones," he agreed. "Invariably," Elizabeth said. And she meant it the way Martha had always meant it, the way her father had meant it, the way everyone who had ever loved a woman like Eleanor Whitmore meant it when they said the word not as a complaint, not as a warning, but as a tribute to a particular kind of strength that does not bow and does not break and does not stop. Even when the time runs out, even when the door closes, even when the truth has to wait years for someone willing to carry it forward. It waits. It always waits. Because the truth is patient, and the women who carry it are patient, and eventually, not always, as soon as it should be, not always without cost, not always without grief. Eventually, the right person comes along in a hired coach with one gray dress and a dead man's notebook habits and 6 weeks of pre-dawn candlelight, and she looks at what has been waiting, and she picks it up, and she carries it home. And that the county said for years and years after was the story of Elizabeth Carter Whitmore. The woman who saved them all by refusing to look away.